had always loved the idea of escaping to a remote cabin. The thought of being completely cut off from the noise of the city, surrounded by dense forest, with only the wind, the trees, and my own thoughts for company, had always felt like a kind of peaceful retreat. I had spent months searching for the right place, scouring online listings, old maps, and forums where people discussed hidden cabins in national forests. Eventually, I found one. A small, weathered log cabin tucked away at the end of a gravel road that barely qualified as a road, in the middle of a national forest in the northern part of the state. It wasn't luxurious. It didn't have electricity, except for a solar panel that powered a single light and a tiny water pump. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dampness, and the windows rattled whenever the wind picked up. It was perfect. The drive up to the cabin was long and exhausting. My car groaned under the weight of my backpack, extra food, and firewood I had packed for the week. The last 10 miles were over dirt roads so uneven that I barely managed 20 miles per hour. Branches scraped the sides of the car, and at times, I had to reverse to avoid deep ruts filled with rainwater. By the time I finally saw the cabin through a clearing of pines and birch trees, the sun was dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. I parked, unloaded the car, and carried my supplies inside. The cabin was small. One main room with a wood stove in the corner, a tiny kitchenette, and a loft bedroom above. Dust coated every surface, and spiderwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I was alone, truly alone, and the silence was absolute. I spent the first night unpacking and settling in. I started a fire in the wood stove, boiled water on the small propane stove, and made a simple dinner of rice and canned beans. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak. At one point, I thought I heard a branch snap nearby. I froze, listening, but it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. The night deepened, and I climbed up to the loft with my sleeping bag. It was colder than I expected, and I had to pile on extra blankets to stay warm. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and the trees seemed to groan under the weight of it. I eventually fell asleep, comforted by the fact that I was prepared, or so I thought. The next morning, I woke to a forest that looked completely untouched. Sunlight filtered through the trees in streaks, lighting patches of moss on the forest floor. Birds called from the branches above, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint rush of a creek. I decided to explore a little. I strapped on my backpack, grabbed my map and compass, and followed a trail that led deeper into the woods. It was easy at first. Soft dirt underfoot, occasional wildflowers, and small birds darting in and out of the underbrush. But after a while, the trail became less clear. Fallen branches and uprooted trees blocked the way, and I had to scramble over logs, push through thick brush, and step carefully across streams. I was careful to note landmarks, making mental notes of tree shapes and large rocks so I could find my way back. By midday, I realized I had gone further than I intended. I had a sense of unease, an inkling that the forest was larger and more isolating than I had imagined. But I kept going, reasoning that as long as I remembered my path, I would be fine. Around late afternoon, the weather shifted suddenly. Clouds gathered, dark and heavy, and the wind began to whip through the trees with a force that tugged at my clothing and backpack. I checked my compass and realized I had veered off the main path. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked different in the gloom. The trees, which had seemed welcoming in the morning light, now towered over me like silent sentinels. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and I found myself second-guessing every turn. The forest had gone quiet. Even the birds had stopped calling. Panic began to rise. I quickened my pace, trying to reach the cabin before darkness fell. I stumbled several times over roots and rocks, scraped my arms on thorny bushes, and twisted my ankle on uneven ground. My heart was pounding, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a branch, the howl of the wind, made me flinch. By the time I found what I thought was the trail back, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Darkness fell fast. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, illuminating only a few feet ahead. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, but soon I realized I had no idea where I was. The trail had vanished under fallen leaves and debris. I tried calling out, hoping the sound of my own voice might guide me, but the forest swallowed it instantly. I stopped to catch my breath and listen, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate where I had come from. That's when I heard it. A low rustling behind me, not like a deer or raccoon, something heavier. My body froze. I held my breath and waited. The rustling moved slowly, deliberately, following my movements. My mind raced with possibilities, wild animals, other people, but the forest was supposed to be empty. I gripped my flashlight like a weapon and turned toward the sound. Nothing, only trees and shadows. I turned again, still nothing. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. I knew I had to keep moving, but every step felt like a gamble. Hours passed, or maybe it was less, maybe more. I had lost all sense of time. My flashlight was running low on batteries. My legs were bruised and scraped, and I was cold. I realized I might have to spend the night in the forest. Panic set in again, but I forced myself to think logically. I had my backpack, which contained a sleeping bag, water, and some snacks. I could make a small shelter using branches and leaves, start a fire if I found dry wood, and wait until morning. I found a small clearing, gathered sticks and brush, and managed to start a fire with my lighter and some dry leaves I had in my bag. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the trees. I sat as close as I dared, feeling the warmth on my face and hands, trying to calm my racing heart. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump, but nothing approached. I stayed awake, watching the fire burn low, until exhaustion finally overtook me. Morning came slowly, the light gray and muted. I was stiff, sore, and hungry, but I felt a small sense of relief when I realized I was still alive. I had survived the night. I packed up what I could, doused the fire, and tried to find my way back. I retraced my steps, using landmarks I could remember and the direction of the sun to guide me. By midday, I stumbled onto a narrow trail I recognized. Relief washed over me like a wave. I followed it, slower now, taking care not to trip, until finally, after hours of careful walking, I saw the cabin in the distance. It looked battered by the wind and rain that had passed overnight, but it was intact. I ran the last few meters and threw myself against the door, relieved beyond words to be back inside. The rest of the day I spent tending to my wounds, drying out wet clothes, and fortifying the cabin as best I could. I checked the solar panel, stocked firewood closer to the stove, and organized my supplies so I would be ready if I ever had to survive another night outside. The experience had left me shaken. I realized just how vulnerable I was alone in the wilderness, how quickly a situation could turn dangerous, and how important preparation and calm thinking were. I spent the evening lighting a steady fire, cooking a simple meal, and letting the quiet of the forest settle around me. The cabin no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a sanctuary I had fought to reach. I stayed awake longer that night, listening to the wind and the trees, grateful for warmth, safety, and the knowledge that I could survive on my own. Over the next few days, I explored closer areas around the cabin, marking safe trails, gathering water, and observing the forest carefully. I learned to read signs of wildlife, recognize safe paths, and conserve my energy. By the end of the week, I felt a quiet confidence. I had faced fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty, and had emerged whole. I packed my things when it was time to leave, taking one last look at the cabin, the forest, and the trails I had mapped in my mind. Driving back down the gravel road, I felt a profound respect for the forest, for preparation, and for the fragility of life in such a remote place. The cabin had been terrifying in its isolation, but it had also taught me resilience, patience, and awareness. I knew I would return one day, but I would never again underestimate the power and unpredictability of the wilderness. I had been planning the trip for months, poring over maps, checking weather patterns, and making lists of supplies. The cabin was tucked far back in the forest, so remote that GPS barely registered the location. I wanted solitude, an escape from the city noise, from the endless chatter of work and life. I told myself it was about peace and reflection, but I think deep down, I was chasing the thrill of isolation, the kind that makes a person feel alive in a raw, urgent way. The drive out of town was long and slow. As the asphalt ended, it gave way to dirt roads, rutted and uneven, and eventually to a narrow path that wound between thick pine and fir trees. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy, leaving the ground in mottled shadows. I kept the windows down, breathing in the sharp scent of pine needles, damp earth, and the faint tang of rotting leaves. There was a quiet rhythm to the drive, the tires crunching over gravel and sticks, punctuated by the occasional rustle of unseen animals. I saw no one. There were no houses, no signs of civilization, nothing but the endless green. When I finally reached the cabin, I stopped the car and just looked at it for a long time. It was small and rustic, more like a hunting lodge than a home. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging slightly in places. Moss had started to grow along the edges, and I could see the faint outline of a chimney leaning a little to one side. A small porch wrapped around the front, with a single rocking chair that looked as though it had been abandoned for years. I unloaded my backpack, carrying in food, water, blankets, and a few other essentials. The cabin was dustier than I expected. There were cobwebs in corners, and a faint musty smell lingered, a mixture of damp wood and the air trapped in a closed space for years. I ran my fingers along the rough walls, noting the knots in the wood, the tiny cracks. Felt solid despite the age, and that gave me a small sense of relief. I started a fire in the old stone fireplace. The kindling was dry, the matches struck easily, and soon there was a warm crackle that filled the empty cabin. I unpacked slowly, setting my things neatly. There was a single bedroom, a small kitchen area, and a living space with a worn rug on the floor. A window looked out into the forest, and through it I could see the shadows shift as the wind passed through the trees. The first night passed quietly. I lay on the thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. There were birds calling somewhere distant, a fox rustling through underbrush, and the occasional snap of a branch. But I also noticed other sounds, subtle ones at first. A dragging noise, a faint scraping against the wood outside. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. The forest was alive with them, and in the dark, small movements became exaggerated, eerie. The next morning, I decided to explore the surroundings. The forest was dense, and the trees grew tall and close together. The sunlight was patchy, creating shifting patterns on the ground. I walked carefully, stepping over roots, feeling the uneven terrain under my boots. The further I went, the quieter it got. Even the wind seemed to slow down, as if it feared disturbing something. I stumbled across old trails, faint lines where other humans had passed, perhaps hunters or hikers long before me. By the second night, the sense of isolation began to weigh on me. I could feel it in my chest, a tightness that I hadn't expected. The air in the cabin seemed heavier, and every small sound made me tense. The scratching outside the cabin grew more persistent. I tried to reason with myself. It was just a tree branch rubbing against the siding, or a raccoon climbing the walls. But my stomach twisted, and I found myself checking the windows over and over, even locking the old wooden door. On the third day, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt around the cabin. At first, I thought it might be mine, but the prints were too large, too wide. They circled the cabin, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I followed them cautiously, trying to see where they led, but the forest swallowed them after a short distance. I didn't see anyone, and yet the idea that someone or something was moving around the cabin in my absence filled me with a cold dread. I started to keep a fire burning constantly during the evenings. I stacked wood higher than I needed, knowing that if I had to stay awake, I would have a source of light and warmth. The nights became long and tense. Every sound outside the cabin seemed deliberate. The wind could no longer explain the creaks and groans of wood. Small things became horrifying, the scuff of dirt against the floor, a sharp tap on the wall, leaves being kicked as if someone were pacing. My mind spun, creating patterns and intentions in the random chaos outside. One afternoon, while exploring the nearby creek, I found more signs. Broken branches, footprints again, and a few spots of dried mud that looked like someone had been standing there, watching. I realized that this was no longer just isolation. It was intrusion. Someone knew I was here, someone moving silently, carefully, around the cabin. The thought made me panic, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself to keep my routines, not to panic, to stay alert. By the fifth night, the tension was unbearable. I barely slept, and when I did, it was in short bursts. Every shadow in the cabin looked like a person standing just outside. I even started carrying a kitchen knife with me, feeling the absurdity of it but unable to stop. The sounds outside were closer now. Footsteps that circled the cabin multiple times, dragging noises as if someone was moving objects, scraping along the porch boards. I was certain someone had been inside, moving things while I was away at the creek. I began to take precautions. I moved furniture to block the windows, nailed boards across the gaps under the door, and set makeshift alarms made from cans tied to strings. Every tiny noise caused me to tense up, heart racing. I was consumed by the feeling that I was being watched, stalked, tested. I refused to leave, even though the thought of running to the nearest road seemed safer. That road was miles away, through dense forest, and I had no idea if anyone would hear me. The nights were endless. I could hear heavy breathing sometimes, or so I thought, and every time I went to check, there was nothing but wind and shadows. I began to ration my supplies carefully, knowing that if this intrusion continued, I could be trapped for days. My mind was fraying. I started keeping a detailed journal of every sound, every shadow, every movement outside. It was a way to maintain control, to give myself something to focus on besides fear. Finally, on the seventh night, everything came to a head. I had been awake for most of the night, keeping a fire going and listening intently. Around midnight, I heard a heavy thump on the porch, followed by a scraping sound like someone dragging something heavy across the boards. My heart leapt, and I grabbed my knife, moving as quietly as possible toward the door. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a person breathing, shallow and deliberate. I froze, weighing my options. I could wait it out, hide in a corner, or confront whoever it was. But instinct took over. I grabbed the heaviest log from the fire, swung it toward the door, and flung it open. The night air hit me hard, cold and damp, but there was no one there. Only the faint outline of footprints leading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. They were fresh, large, and fast-moving. Whoever had been there was gone, retreating before I could even react. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting next to the fire, every sense alert. By morning, the footprints were still visible but fading under dew and wind. I spent hours tracking them, seeing where they led, but they vanished into the dense undergrowth. There was no way to know who it was or why they had been watching. I realized that I had survived not through strength or cunning, but through instinct and sheer luck. After that, I decided to leave. I packed up slowly, methodically, keeping watch in all directions. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow looked like someone watching. The forest seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before. Predatory, patient, calculating. As I walked back along the path to the dirt road, I kept my eyes on the trees, ready to run at any moment. When I reached my car, I paused, looking back toward the cabin, half expecting to see someone standing there. There was nothing, only the quiet rustle of the trees. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away slowly, eyes scanning the edges of the road until the forest finally thinned. By the time I reached the paved highway, my hands were shaking, exhaustion weighing every muscle, but there was relief too. I had survived the isolation, the intrusion, and the fear. Looking back, I understood that the cabin had given me something unexpected. It had forced me to confront fear in its rawest form, not from monsters or ghosts, but from human presence, from the unknown. I had been planning to spend a week alone in a small cabin I had rented deep in the woods, far away from towns, noise, and people. The idea was to disconnect completely, to have no interruptions, no ringing phones, no one knocking at my door, no emails to answer. Nothing. Just me, a cabin, and the silence of the forest. I had always imagined it as something calming, almost healing. I thought I needed the quiet because life in the city had been burning me out, with the traffic, the endless pressure of work, and the way days felt like they were vanishing faster than I could hold on to them. The cabin I found was older, not some polished vacation rental with new furniture and bright windows. It was tucked back off a narrow dirt road that wound for miles through thick forest. The trees seemed to swallow the road the farther I drove, and eventually the path was so narrow that branches scraped the sides of my car. The cabin itself was a single-story wooden structure, faded brown from years of weather, with a small covered porch, a single chimney, and 2 visible windows at the front. It looked like something built 50 years ago by someone who wanted to be left alone. When I stepped inside for the first time, the smell hit me. Old wood, faint mildew, dust, and something else that I couldn't name, like the smell of a place that hadn't had anyone living in it for a long time. The air was heavy and still. There was no electricity out there, only a propane stove, a wood stove for heat, and lanterns. The furniture was simple. 2 chairs, a wooden table, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a small shelf with some random items left behind by whoever had stayed there before. A box of matches, an old pocket knife, a few half-burned candles. I unpacked slowly, taking everything out of my backpack, laying out food supplies, water jugs, and my sleeping bag. I had a cooler with ice that I knew wouldn't last more than a few days, so I planned my meals carefully. The sun had already started dropping by the time I was settled. Out there, without city lights, darkness came quickly. Within minutes, the cabin seemed to be swallowed whole by the night. That first night, I sat at the small table with a lantern burning, writing in a notebook I had brought. I kept noticing the silence pressing on the cabin, so complete that every creak of the old wood seemed louder than it should. At one point, I heard something outside, maybe a branch snapping. I told myself it was a deer moving through the trees. Still, I found myself pausing, holding my breath, listening. Then silence again, so total that I could hear my own heartbeat. When I went to bed, I left the lantern burning low. The cabin walls were thin, and the sounds outside carried too easily. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, hearing nothing but the occasional groan of the wood as the temperature dropped. At some point, I fell asleep, though it was shallow, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up stiff, the air inside cold enough to see my breath. I got the wood stove going, boiled water for instant coffee, and sat on the porch while steam rose from the mug. The forest looked endless, stretching out in every direction, heavy with morning mist. No other cabins, no roads, no people. Just me. At first it felt freeing, like I had finally found the quiet I had been chasing. But by the second day, that quiet started to feel different. Too heavy. The woods were so still that even the smallest sound stood out. A squirrel running across leaves sounded like something much larger. A crow flying overhead made me jump. I began to notice things, little details that unsettled me. The way branches near the tree line would sway when there was no wind. The way the silence seemed to pause at times, like even the birds and insects were holding their breath. That evening, as the sun went down, I went out to gather more wood. I kept feeling like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling stayed. Every time I bent to pick up a piece of wood, I felt exposed, like eyes were on me from the dark wall of trees. When I finally went back inside and dropped the wood beside the stove, I locked the door without thinking. The lock was just a simple sliding bolt, nothing that would stop someone determined to get in, but I felt better hearing it click into place. That night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of my dream, but when I opened my eyes, I heard it again. A crunch, the sound of footsteps on leaves. Slow, steady, deliberate. My chest tightened, and I lay perfectly still, listening. The steps came closer, circling the cabin, then stopping just outside the wall near the bed. The thin wood separated me from whoever or whatever was standing there. I could hear my pulse hammering in my ears. The steps moved again, this time toward the porch. I could hear the old boards creak under weight. Then silence. I waited, every muscle tense, barely breathing. Minutes dragged on, each second feeling stretched thin. I thought about reaching for the knife I had unpacked, but I was too afraid to even move. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I heard the steps fade away into the trees. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear. But deep down, I knew it hadn't sounded like that. The weight, the rhythm of the steps, the way they stopped exactly outside the wall near my bed. It had been a person. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept checking the tree line, scanning for movement. I couldn't relax, couldn't focus on anything. When night came again, I was on edge before the sun even set. I built the fire higher, kept the lanterns lit longer. Still, I couldn't stop the feeling that someone was out there, waiting for the cover of dark. That night, it happened again. The same slow steps, circling, stopping, waiting. This time, I sat up in bed with the knife in my hand, my back against the wall. I didn't sleep at all, just listened to the footsteps until they finally disappeared hours later. By the third day, I was exhausted. My hands shook when I tried to make coffee, and I could barely keep my eyes open. I thought about leaving, but the road was long, and I wasn't sure my car would handle the rough path in the dark. I told myself I would pack up in the morning and go back to the city early. I couldn't take another night like that, but that last night was the worst. As soon as it was dark, the footsteps came again. This time there was no pause, no circling. The steps came straight to the porch, heavy and slow. The boards creaked under the weight. Then I heard the sound of the door handle being tested. A rattle, then silence. My throat was dry, my chest tight. The bolt held, but the handle turned again, harder this time. I sat frozen in the bed, knife in hand, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then I heard it, the sound of breathing on the other side of the door. Slow, steady, human. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever. Then the handle stopped rattling. The boards creaked again as the weight shifted away, and the footsteps faded back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. I sat there until the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the shutters. As soon as I could see outside, I packed everything into my backpack and dragged it to the car. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice before getting them into the ignition. When the engine finally started, the sound was the most comforting thing I had ever heard. I drove down that dirt road faster than I should have, branches scraping the car as I forced it through the narrow path. I didn't look back once. When I finally reached pavement hours later, I pulled over and sat in the car, breathing hard, trying to calm myself. I had planned to stay a week. I hadn't lasted 4 nights. I knew it hadn't been an animal. Animals don't test door handles. Animals don't stand breathing outside your door in the middle of the night. Someone had been out there watching me, circling the cabin, waiting, and I would never know who it was or what they wanted. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to a place like that again. The silence I thought I wanted had turned into something else, something heavy, something that felt alive. Out there in the woods, I hadn't been alone. I had been driving for hours when I finally turned off the main highway onto a narrow, gravel road that wound its way deep into the mountains. My car bounced over potholes and loose rocks, the tires sending up clouds of dust that quickly settled into the darkening forest around me. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo retreat in a cabin I had rented through a small local listing. It was described as rustic, off the grid, peaceful. The perfect escape from the city's constant noise and demands. At the time, I had only imagined serene mornings with mist curling over the river nearby, evenings by a wood stove, and the rare sound of a bird or squirrel breaking the silence. I hadn't imagined the fear that would seep into my chest the moment I realized how isolated I really was. The sun had just begun to dip behind the trees when I reached the turnoff for the cabin itself. The road narrowed even further, flanked by towering pines whose dark branches nearly met overhead. My headlights caught glimpses of rough boulders and fallen logs, and I had to drive slowly, sometimes inching forward to avoid scraping the underside of my car on protruding roots or uneven terrain. The GPS signal was patchy, flickering between no signal and searching, leaving me unsure if I was even on the right path. When I finally saw it, a small wooden cabin, weathered but intact, I felt a wave of relief. The structure was modest, a single story with a steep roof and a tiny porch. The paint was faded, the wood grayed from years of sun and rain, and moss grew in patches along the roof's edges. The surrounding forest pressed in close on all sides, so thick that it almost felt like the trees themselves were watching me. I parked my car on a small, uneven clearing in front of the cabin and grabbed my bag from the trunk. Taking a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air, the cabin was quiet, empty, and still. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood smoke and dampness, like it had been closed up for a while. Dust floated in the fading light, making the air feel heavier than it should. There were a few basic furnishings: a small wooden table with a couple of chairs, a metal-framed bed with a thin mattress, and a wood stove in the corner, cold and blackened from previous use. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, a tiny refrigerator, and a gas stove. No running water beyond the sink, no central heating, nothing beyond the basics. I dropped my bag and went to inspect the woodpile outside, thinking about starting a fire for warmth. The logs were damp, and splitting them would take effort, but I managed to get a few pieces ready. As I was stacking them near the stove, I noticed something odd: a set of footprints in the soft earth outside the cabin. They were human, bare, and seemed fresh. My first thought was that maybe the previous occupants hadn't left long ago, or that a neighbor had wandered close. But the area was so remote that the thought quickly turned into unease. I looked around. The forest was still, no movement, no sound beyond the occasional creak of trees in the wind. I ignored it for the moment, lighting a fire in the stove and unpacking my supplies. As darkness settled over the forest, the cabin became a small island of light and warmth, the glow from the fire casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I tried to focus on the routine of setting up, laying out my sleeping bag, preparing some food, but the footprints kept lingering in my mind. I peered through the small windows, scanning the edge of the forest where they had appeared. Nothing, just darkness. Around midnight, I was woken by a faint sound outside, a scraping or dragging that made my stomach tighten. It was subtle, almost like a branch brushing across a rock, but it had a rhythm, deliberate and heavy. I froze, straining to hear, my heart beginning to race. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and shadows stretched across the room, making every corner seem alive. I moved cautiously to the window and looked out. At first, I saw nothing, then, just for a moment, I thought I saw a figure crouched near the treeline. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the shadows, a tree branch moving in the wind, the mind playing tricks when alone in a place like this. But the unease settled in my chest, heavy and insistent. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, made sure my knife was within reach, and tried to go back to sleep. Sleep came fitfully, broken by every small sound: the whistle of wind, the crack of wood settling, the occasional rustle in the brush outside. Morning brought relief, at least temporarily. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the forest seemed calm again. I went outside to survey the area, hoping that daylight would make everything feel less threatening. The footprints from the night before were still visible, now clearer in the morning light. There were more of them, scattered around the cabin, some leading into the trees, others circling close to the porch. Whoever or whatever had made them had spent time here. My stomach churned as I realized that I was completely alone, without neighbors for miles, and these prints suggested someone had been close enough to touch the cabin without me knowing. I spent the day making sure the perimeter was clear, moving logs to block entry points, stacking rocks near the cabin, and keeping a fire ready. I tried to keep busy, collecting water from a nearby stream, chopping more firewood, taking stock of my supplies. But every shadow, every sound of rustling leaves, made me jump. By late afternoon, I had begun to notice something else: signs of disturbance in the surrounding forest. broken branches, scuff marks on the dirt, the sense that someone or multiple people had moved through the area. I even found scraps of what looked like torn fabric snagged on branches, remnants of clothing. The second night was worse. The sounds outside grew louder, more deliberate. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin, the dragging of something along the ground. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them clearly, close enough to know they were right outside. I sat with my back to the wall, knife in hand, fire in front of me, trying to calm my racing thoughts. At one point, something hit the cabin wall, a hard thump that made the entire structure shudder. I could feel the vibration through the floorboards. I stayed awake the entire night, watching, listening, every muscle tense. By dawn, I was exhausted, covered in sweat despite the cold, and my mind felt stretched thin. I decided I couldn't stay another night without a plan. I packed a bag with the essentials: water, food, knife, matches, and made a careful plan to leave. I waited until the early morning, when the first light hit the trees, and then I moved quickly, staying low and close to the cabin, avoiding the open areas as much as possible. As I made my way to the car, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt, new and heading toward the cabin. Whoever had been here hadn't left yet, hadn't given up. I tried not to panic, keeping my mind focused on the route I had come. The forest seemed quieter now, but my senses were alert to every sound, every movement. When I finally reached my car, I checked the surroundings one last time. Nothing. The gravel road lay ahead, winding back toward the highway, away from the cabin, away from the forest. The drive back was tense. Every shadow along the road, every tree bending in the wind, made my heart skip a beat. I didn't stop for brakes, didn't slow down for anything beyond the road itself. Hours later, I finally reached a small town with gas stations, traffic lights, and people. The normalcy of the place hit me like a wave, a sense of relief washing over me. I filled the car with gas, bought some food, and called a friend to tell them where I had been. Later, when I thought back on the experience, I realized how fragile safety can feel in an isolated place. The cabin itself was nothing extraordinary, just wood, stone, and a bit of furniture. But being alone, exposed, and vulnerable changed everything. I never found out who had made those footprints or whether they had been watching the cabin the entire time. I reported the incident to the local authorities afterward, and they confirmed that the area had a history of occasional trespassers, usually hikers or hunters, but nothing violent had ever been reported. I never returned to that cabin. Couldn't. Even now, the memory of the heavy footsteps outside, the scratches in the dirt, and the sense of being watched in total darkness stays with me. I learned a lesson I can't forget. No matter how peaceful a place seems, isolation carries its own dangers, and sometimes, the most terrifying experiences are entirely real, entirely human, and entirely avoidable if you respect the quiet but unpredictable power of the wild. I wanted time alone, away from the noise of people and the routine of my life. I thought staying in a cabin near the woods would give me that peace. I rented one deep in the hills, far from town, by a quiet lake. The owner gave me directions that led me down a narrow dirt road with no signs, only trees pressing close on both sides. The road was rough, filled with rocks and roots, and I had to keep slowing down so I would not wreck the tires. After almost an hour of moving through thick forest with no houses, no power lines, no cars passing me, I reached the cabin. The place was small, one floor with dark wooden walls, and the roof sagged in the middle. It sat right by the lake, only a few steps from the water. The lake was wide, with black water that did not move much. The trees grew tall all around it, and they blocked most of the sunlight. Everything looked still. The only sound was the wind moving through branches. The cabin door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it was plain. A small kitchen on the left, a single bedroom in the back, a living room with old furniture that smelled faintly of mold. The floorboards bent under my weight. There was no television, no phone service, only a battery lantern and some candles. The air inside felt colder than it was outside, like the place had not been used for a while. I put my bags down and checked every room. The windows were dirty, with streaks of dried rain and dust. Some were cracked at the corners. The bed had a thin mattress and smelled faintly like damp wood. On the shelf in the living room were some old books, their pages yellow and curled. Everything felt forgotten, as if nobody had stayed here in years, though the owner told me it was rented out often. I told myself I would adjust. The silence was part of the experience I wanted. I unpacked my things, set some food in the small fridge that ran on gas, and sat outside by the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the dark trees and a pale gray sky. Across the lake, there was no sign of life, no cabins, no docks, nothing but endless forest. At first, the peace felt good. I listened to the birds, the occasional rustle in the brush, the sound of wind. The air smelled like pine and wet soil, but the stillness also felt heavy, almost pressing. Every sound stood out too sharp, like footsteps on gravel, even when I knew it was just branches shifting. That night, I tried to sleep early. The bed was stiff and the cabin creaked with every gust of wind. I left a candle burning on the small table near the bed. Outside, the forest grew darker than anything I was used to. No streetlights, no distant glow from a town, just solid black pressing against the windows. The sounds changed too. The birds went silent, replaced by frogs and the occasional high-pitched call of something I could not name. At some point, I woke up to a noise. It was faint but clear, like something scraping against wood. My first thought was that a branch was dragging against the cabin wall. I listened, holding my breath. The sound came again, slower this time, like someone running a stick across the siding. I sat up, staring at the window, but saw nothing except my own reflection in the glass. After a while, it stopped. I lay back down and tried to convince myself it was the wind. The next morning, I went outside to check. The side of the cabin had long scratch marks in the dirt near the base, but nothing else. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of anyone or anything. I brushed it off. Maybe an animal. The forest was full of them. During the day, I tried to hike along the lake. The ground was soft and uneven, roots sticking out everywhere. I walked until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. The forest grew thicker, and the farther I went, the quieter it became. At some point, I realized I had not heard birds for a while. The silence was too deep, almost unnatural. I turned back, uneasy, and felt relief when I saw the cabin again. Later in the afternoon, I noticed something across the lake. At first, it looked like a fallen tree, but then I realized it was a large branch sticking upright from the water, leaning at an angle. It had not been there earlier. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out if it had drifted from somewhere else. The lake was still, no current strong enough to move something that large. I shrugged it off but kept glancing at it. The second night was worse. The sounds outside were sharper, louder. I heard the same scraping, then what sounded like slow steps in the dirt outside the cabin. I sat on the bed, heart racing, listening as the sounds circled around, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Every time I thought they were gone, they started again, closer. I wanted to look outside, but fear kept me frozen. After hours, exhaustion won and I drifted off to sleep, though it was broken and restless. The next morning, I found fresh prints in the soft dirt near the cabin. They were not from shoes. They were long, uneven, almost human but wider, with toes spread far apart. The prints circled the cabin, stopping at the back door. My chest tightened when I saw them. I told myself maybe it was a large animal, though no animal I knew left prints shaped like that. I considered leaving, but part of me felt stubborn. I had driven hours to get here. I wanted the break I planned. I told myself I was being paranoid. I tried to ignore the unease. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, fishing off the small wooden dock. The water was dark, so dark that even when I leaned over, I could not see more than a few inches below the surface. I thought about the prints. I thought about the scraping sound. The forest felt like it was watching me, though I knew that was impossible. At sunset, I noticed the branch in the lake was gone. Where it had been, the water rippled faintly. I stared at the spot until night fell. The third night, I could not sleep at all. The noises came back, louder this time. Something banged against the side of the cabin, hard enough to rattle the lantern on the shelf. My chest pounded so hard it hurt. I gripped the edge of the bed, waiting for the noise to stop. Then I heard the back door handle rattle. Slow at first, then harder. I froze. The door was locked, but I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with. The rattling went on for minutes, then silence. After what felt like hours, I crept to the window. Outside, in the faint moonlight, I saw movement near the trees. A tall shape, too tall to be an animal, stood half hidden by shadows. It was still facing the cabin. I stumbled back from the window, heart hammering. By morning, the shape was gone, but the prints were deeper, closer to the cabin than before. My fear was stronger than my stubbornness now. I started packing. When I carried my bags to the car, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The tires were slashed, all 4 of them. The cuts were clean, deep, straight through the rubber. My only way out was gone. Panic rose sharp and heavy in my chest. I looked around, half expecting to see the tall shape again. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. I carried everything back inside, locked the door, and tried to think. The cabin had no phone service, no radio, no way to call for help. The road back to town was miles long, through heavy forest. Walking would take hours, maybe a full day, and I did not know if I would make it. I decided to wait until daylight was strongest, then try. But the hours crawled by, and fear kept me pinned inside. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow at the window looked like something watching. That night, I did not sleep. The noises returned, closer than ever. Something scraped the walls again, circled the cabin, tapped on the windows. At one point, the front door shook like someone was pushing against it. The wood groaned. I sat on the floor with a kitchen knife clutched in my hand, my whole body trembling. The sun rose slow, but when it did, I forced myself to leave. I stuffed food, water, and the knife into a backpack, locked the cabin behind me though it meant nothing, and started walking the dirt road. My legs felt weak, but I kept moving. For hours I walked. The forest pressed close, silent. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain something was behind me. Sometimes I thought I saw movement between trees, a tall, dark shape keeping pace. But when I stopped, nothing was there. As the sun lowered, I realized I was not even halfway. My pace slowed, exhaustion pulling at me. My throat was dry, my stomach hollow. I kept walking. The road stretched endless through the woods. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me, steady, slow. My chest tightened, breath caught in my throat. I did not turn. I broke into a run, feet slamming the dirt. Branches whipped at my arms. My lungs burned. I ran until my legs almost gave out, then risked a glance back. The road was empty, but the prints were there, fresh, deep in the dirt, almost touching my own. I kept moving until night came. The forest turned black around me. I had been planning the cabin trip for weeks. The idea was simple. A few days alone, away from the noise of town, with no phone calls, no work, and no people around to bother me. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who rarely used it anymore. It was tucked deep in the woods, the kind of place where you had to drive down a long dirt road until it ended, then walk another short trail to reach it. When I got the key, I was warned that it was old, simple, and not modern, but that suited me fine. I wanted silence, trees, the smell of pine, and the sound of the wind instead of engines and voices. The first day was normal enough. I reached the cabin in the early afternoon after the long drive. The road narrowed the deeper I went, until it was only dirt with branches brushing the sides of my car. I parked in the clearing where the trees opened up just enough to see the roof of the cabin. It was small, wooden, with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were covered in dust, but they still reflected the sun. The air felt different there, heavier somehow, but cleaner than the air back home. When I opened the door and stepped inside, I smelled the mix of old wood, dust, and the faintest hint of dampness. the kind of smell you expect from a place that stays closed up most of the year. The inside was one open space with a small kitchen on one side, a table in the center, and a couch pushed against the far wall near a fireplace. There was one bedroom and a bathroom. It was nothing special, but it was enough. I set down my bag and walked around to check everything. The plumbing worked. The stove ran on propane. The fireplace had a small stack of wood beside it. Everything was in order. I felt good. I felt like I had made the right choice. The first night passed quietly. I cooked a simple meal, read a book, and went to sleep early. The woods outside were darker than any night I'd seen before. When I turned off the lights, the only glow came from the thin line of the moon through the window. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled or the distant sound of wind in the trees. It took me a while to fall asleep, but once I did, I slept hard. The next morning I woke early. The sun came through the thin curtains, and the chill of the night still lingered inside. I put on a jacket and went outside. The clearing around the cabin was small, maybe 20 yards across, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. The trees towered high, and the ground was covered in pine needles. I stood there for a while, breathing in the cool air and listening to the forest. I could hear birds, the faint rustle of something small moving through the underbrush, and the constant whisper of the wind. Felt good, peaceful. Later that day, I decided to walk further into the woods. I wanted to stretch my legs and see how far the land went. I followed a narrow path that wound between the trees. After about 20 minutes of walking, I came across something unexpected. It was an old hunting stand, half-rotten, nailed into a tree. The wood was gray and splintered, the latter missing a few rungs. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I stood there looking at it for a while, then moved on. The forest seemed endless in every direction. I turned back after an hour, not wanting to get lost. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something small but strange. On the porch, near the steps, was a footprint. It wasn't mine. I had been wearing heavy boots, and this was lighter, narrower, maybe from a sneaker. The dirt was soft enough to show it clearly. It looked fresh. I crouched down, studying it. My first thought was that maybe it had been there from before, but the edges were sharp, not weathered. It hadn't rained recently, so it couldn't have been old. I stood there staring at it for a while, trying to reason with myself. Maybe a hiker had passed by. Maybe a hunter. The woods were big, and it wasn't impossible. But the cabin was at the end of the road, with no reason for anyone to be walking past. I tried to push it out of my head. That night, I couldn't shake the thought of the footprint. I locked the door, even though I hadn't planned to, and I checked the windows twice before going to bed. I lay there in the dark, listening harder than the night before. Every sound felt louder. The creak of the wood, the sigh of the trees outside. At one point, I thought I heard something faint, like footsteps outside, but it was gone as soon as it came. I told myself it was an animal and tried to sleep. The following morning, I went outside again. I checked the porch first thing, and my stomach tightened when I saw the dirt. There were new prints, more than one this time. They were scattered near the steps and around the side of the cabin. I walked slowly, following them as they circled halfway around before fading into the harder ground. My mind raced with possibilities. If it had been a hiker, why circle the cabin? Why not knock? Why not leave? I felt exposed standing out there, like I was being watched. I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself it had to be nothing. Maybe kids exploring. Maybe someone lost. But the feeling in my gut didn't agree. I decided to be more cautious. I kept the doors locked. I stayed closer to the cabin instead of wandering far. I cooked food, tried to read, but my attention kept drifting to the windows. I caught myself glancing outside every few minutes, searching for movement between the trees. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like it was pressing in, hiding something just out of sight. That night was worse. The air was still, no wind, no rustling, just silence. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. The crunch of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, moving across the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps circled, pausing now and then continued. They moved across the porch. The wood groaned under the weight. I could picture someone standing just feet away from me, separated only by the thin wall of the cabin. I wanted to move, to grab something, but I stayed frozen. I didn't hear a knock. I didn't hear a voice. Just the slow shifting of weight on the boards, then silence. Long minutes passed before I dared to breathe again. When morning finally came, I barely felt human. My body ached from the tension of the night. I stepped outside cautiously. The dirt showed what I had feared. More prints, clear as day, circling the cabin again. Someone had been out there. There was no denying it now. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into the trees. I wanted to follow, to see where they led, but I couldn't bring myself to step off the safety of the clearing. I felt trapped. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to break in yet, but why were they there? Why just watching? I tried to reason with myself again. Maybe it was a hunter checking the land. Maybe someone camping nearby. But deep down, I knew this wasn't random. They were coming back night after night, circling, waiting. I went up to the cabin thinking I was going to have a quiet weekend. It was late in the fall, the kind of time when the air carried that heavy cold smell of leaves that were wet from earlier rains. The trees around the place were thinning out since most of the leaves had dropped, but enough still clung to the branches that the woods had a dull orange and brown look. I had been to the cabin a few times before, but never alone. This time I wanted the silence, the break from noise, and the chance to clear my head. The cabin sat about 3 miles off a narrow dirt road that itself was about 10 miles from the nearest small town. Once I parked my truck and walked the rest of the short uphill path. I knew I wouldn't see another person unless someone had a reason to be out here. That thought had comforted me when I planned the trip. I packed enough food for a few days, firewood stacked from the last visit, and a small generator if I needed light. Most of the time I planned to sit with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees. The first day went smooth. I arrived just after noon, got the fire going, unpacked my supplies, and checked the cabin. It was a small square one-room place with a loft where the bed was. The windows had heavy shutters I could close if the weather turned. There was no phone line, no internet, and my cell barely showed 1 bar if I walked out toward the ridge. That was fine with me. I had a couple of books, a journal, and I figured the time would pass quietly. That night, I sat near the wood stove, listening to the fire pop and crack, and I felt a kind of peace I hadn't had in months. The woods outside were still except for the faint sound of an owl somewhere down the slope. The darkness pressed against the cabin, but I didn't think much about it. I blew out the lantern around midnight, climbed into the loft, and listened to the crack of cooling wood until I fell asleep. The second day, I hiked a little further out behind the ridge. I followed an old trail that had been used years ago by hunters. The leaves muffled my steps, and I felt almost cut off from the world. I came across deer tracks, a few squirrels, and once the sound of something heavy moving deeper in the brush, maybe a buck. The air had a bite to it, and the sky stayed gray all afternoon. When I came back toward the cabin, I noticed something that caught me a little off guard. The path leading up to the cabin had fresh prints in the leaves. They weren't mine, and they didn't belong to an animal. The shape and length of them were boots, pressed heavy into the soft, damp ground. At first I thought maybe they were old, left from someone passing through earlier in the week. But when I looked closer, I saw the edges of the prints were sharp, not softened by time or rain. They were new, maybe a few hours old. I told myself maybe a hunter had passed by. The season wasn't open yet, but sometimes people scouted early. Still, the tracks didn't angle past the cabin. They led right up to it. I followed them with my eyes, and they stopped near the front steps. After that, I couldn't see them. The ground there was too packed. Inside the cabin, everything looked the same. Nothing had been moved. My pack and food sat where I left them, but I couldn't shake the thought of those prints. I walked around the cabin, circling slowly. Behind the cabin, the ground was rough with roots, but I thought I saw a faint depression heading back into the trees. I bent down, checked closely, and I was sure it was the same tread pattern. Someone had walked right up to my cabin, lingered, then turned and went back into the woods. The air felt colder as I stood there. I stayed outside longer than I should have, scanning the trees, trying to see movement. Nothing stirred but a crow that lifted off and called down at me. Finally, I went inside and shut the door. I put the heavy bar across it and checked the shutters. Every one of them was closed and latched. That night, the peace I felt the first night was gone. I couldn't stop picturing someone walking around the cabin while I had been out in the woods. I kept listening to every sound, each creak in the wood or brush of wind across the roof. I barely slept. When I did drift off, I woke again with my heart racing, sure I had heard something outside. The third morning, I walked the perimeter again. The prints from the day before were fading a little as the leaves dried, but I could still make them out. I followed them back into the woods farther than before. They wound down a slope, across a small creek, and then vanished in a patch of hard rocky ground. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees ahead. The woods were silent except for a steady tapping of water dripping from the branches. I didn't like the feeling of chasing the tracks and then losing them. It was as if whoever had left them knew where they would disappear. I walked back slower, my eyes darting left and right, half expecting to see someone standing and watching me. But the woods stayed empty. When I reached the cabin, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The door bar was shifted, not by much, but enough that I knew I hadn't left it that way. I remembered exactly how it sat when I slid it into place the night before. Now it was crooked, the edge not tight in the slot. My hands felt numb as I lifted it and pushed the door open. The cabin looked normal, but I checked everything. My pack was closed, but I noticed the zipper was halfway down, not how I left it. A can of beans from the shelf was on the table. I had not touched it. Someone had been inside. I stood in the center of the room, listening so hard my ears hurt. The loft above me was empty, I knew, because I had cleared it before. There was no place to hide in the cabin, but the thought that someone had walked inside while I was gone made my skin crawl. I stepped back out, circled the cabin again, but saw nothing. I thought about leaving right then, but my truck was parked down the slope, and if someone was watching, the walk to it would leave me out in the open. I decided to stay one more night, but to be ready. I kept my hunting knife close and made sure the hatchet was set by the stove. As darkness came, I shut the lantern off and sat in the loft, staring down through the gaps in the railing. I wanted the cabin dark so if anyone came near, I could see without being seen. Hours passed with only the sound of the fire fading. Then, close to midnight, I heard it. The crunch of leaves outside, slow and steady. The sound circled once, then stopped. I held my breath until my chest ached. Minutes dragged. I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then the door creaked, just a slight shift, as if weight had pressed against it. The bar held, but the wood groaned. I gripped the knife so hard my hand cramped. After that, silence again. I sat unmoving until the first gray light of morning. When I finally opened the door, the ground showed prints again. This time they led from the trees right up to the steps and back. Whoever it was had come in the night, tested the door, and left. I didn't waste time. I packed fast, stuffing everything into my pack without care. I kept checking the tree line as I moved. The prints led off toward the same slope where I had lost them before. I had no idea if the person was still close or had gone hours ago. The walk down to the truck felt endless. Every few steps I turned, scanning the woods. I thought I heard movement behind me once, but when I stopped, the sound stopped too. My throat felt dry, and my back prickled with the thought of eyes on me. When I reached the truck, nothing looked touched. I started it and drove faster than I should down the narrow dirt road, bouncing over ruts. Only when I hit the paved road did I breathe fully. That weekend was supposed to be quiet. Instead, it showed me how thin the line is between peace and fear. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, walking right up to my cabin. They never said a word, never showed themselves, but they let me know I wasn't alone. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. It still stands in the woods, but the thought of walking into it and seeing fresh prints in the leaves again is enough to keep me away. Out there, far from town, no locked door or thick shutter can change the fact that if someone wants to get close, they can. And you may never even know until it's too late. I had been looking forward to spending a week at the cabin for months. The place belonged to a friend of my uncle who didn't use it often, and I was told I could have it for as long as I wanted before the colder season rolled in. It sat deep in the woods, about an hour from the nearest small town, surrounded by tall pine and oak trees that cut off most outside noise. The gravel road that led to it twisted through the hills until it turned into a dirt path that grew narrower the further you drove, and by the time I reached the small clearing, it felt like I had been swallowed by the forest completely. The cabin itself was simple: dark brown logs, a small front porch with a broken railing, a metal chimney pipe sticking out at an angle from the roof, and windows that looked old but still held up against the weather. Inside, it had only the basics: a small kitchen with an old gas stove, a couple of counters, a fridge that ran off propane, a main room with a couch and wood stove, a single bedroom with a creaky bed, and a bathroom with a pump system that drew water from a tank. It wasn't luxury, but that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted the quiet, the separation from everything else. The first day was uneventful. I arrived around noon, unpacked my bag, stacked some wood by the stove, and then walked around the area to get a feel for it. The air smelled cleaner than in the city, sharper, full of pine and damp earth. I walked down to a stream about a quarter mile away and followed it for a while until it curved back into denser brush I didn't want to fight through. The sound of running water was calming, and the sun cut down in beams between the tree branches. When I got back to the cabin, I cooked something simple and sat outside as the light faded. The forest grew darker faster than I expected. By nightfall, the silence was heavy. I had lived in quiet neighborhoods before, but this was different. There was no hum of distant cars, no voices, no faint city sounds, just the occasional chirp of an insect or the wind moving through the trees. I told myself that was the point, but still it unsettled me. It wasn't just quiet, it was isolating, like the world outside didn't exist anymore. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound I couldn't place at first. It was faint but sharp enough to cut through the silence. A crunch, like weight shifting on leaves or gravel. My heart picked up, and I lay in bed listening. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. Deer moved through forests all the time, and raccoons rummaged at night. The noise came again, slow and deliberate, and it sounded closer than before. I sat up in bed, staring at the dark window, trying to see if something moved outside. Nothing, just the vague outline of trees against the night sky. I stayed awake for what felt like an hour, waiting for another sound, but the forest went silent again. When I finally drifted back to sleep, I told myself I had imagined it or blown it out of proportion. The second day passed without anything strange. I chopped some firewood, hiked a trail nearby, and tried to relax. But when night came, I couldn't shake the memory of that sound. I kept checking the windows, kept pausing to listen whenever the cabin creaked. Around midnight, I thought I heard something brush against the porch railing. Just one quick scrape. My body went cold. I didn't move, just sat in the dark staring at the front door until my eyes hurt. Nothing else happened, and I tried to convince myself the wind had shifted something loose. By the third night, I was restless. I was tired of jumping at every sound, but I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something was out there. That evening, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the dirt patch near the side of the cabin, there were marks. At first, I thought they were from an animal, but the more I looked, the less sure I was. The shape was too long, almost like the edge of a shoe had pressed into the dirt, but not clear enough to confirm. I crouched down and touched the mark. The dirt felt freshly disturbed. I stood there staring at it until I realized how vulnerable I felt kneeling outside the cabin alone. I went back in and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. They circled slowly around the cabin. One step at a time, steady, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard them. My whole body tensed, and I didn't even breathe for a while. I thought about grabbing something to defend myself with, but I had nothing useful. just a kitchen knife that wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get in. I stayed still, listening as the steps moved from the front porch to the back of the cabin. They lingered there for a long time. I stared at the door until I thought my eyes would dry out. Eventually, the sounds faded. I never heard them leave, not fully. I stayed awake until the light of morning finally showed through the window. When I walked outside, I looked around the cabin carefully. On the side where I thought the steps had stopped, the dirt looked pressed down. Long, thin marks trailed off into the trees, not clear enough to show shape, but enough to prove something heavy had been there. I told myself I should leave, drive back to town, find somewhere else to stay, just get away. But the thought of packing up and admitting I had been scared off by noises felt like weakness I didn't want to give into. I told myself maybe it was hunters, maybe kids messing around. I tried to hold on to the idea that there was some normal explanation. That day, I carried wood inside, checked the windows, and kept the door locked. I stayed closer to the cabin, always glancing toward the trees, always feeling like something was watching me. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt heavy, pressing in closer, too quiet, waiting. When night came again, I left the lantern off and sat in the dark. I wanted to hear clearly if something came back. Hours passed, and I nearly convinced myself nothing would happen. Then, close to 2 in the morning, I heard the porch creak. The sound was sharp and heavy, like weight settling on the boards. My chest tightened, and I stared at the front door, seeing the faint outline in the dim light. The wood groaned again, closer to the door. I sat frozen. No knock, no voice, just that slow pressure on the boards. Then it stopped. I waited, but nothing else came. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. I didn't sleep. I sat up until dawn, staring at the door, barely blinking. In the morning, I walked outside again. The dirt in front of the porch was disturbed. Clear this time. A footprint. Not boots, not anything heavy, just a simple shoe print. Human. My stomach dropped. There was no more pretending. Someone had been at the cabin. I'll continue the story in full detail until it reaches the clear ending. I had been looking forward to spending some time alone in the woods, away from the noise of town and the steady rhythm of work. The cabin I rented was small, old, and quiet, tucked deep off a dirt road that wound up into the hills. I thought the isolation would be peaceful. I thought being away from people would clear my head and give me some time to reset. I did not know how heavy silence could feel, or how different it was when the only thing between me and the outside world was a thin wooden wall. The cabin was simple. A single main room with a bed in the corner, a small table, a wood stove for heat, and a short hallway that led to a tiny kitchen and bathroom. The wood was old and dry, the boards creaked when I walked across them, and every nail and seam seemed to groan if the wind touched the place. I noticed how the front door leaned a little in its frame and how the locks didn't feel strong. I pushed the door shut several times that first evening just to be sure it latched. Out here, with no one around, a flimsy door made me nervous. I arrived in the afternoon. The sun was still high, and the air smelled of pine and damp dirt. I hauled my things from the car, parked 100 feet away by a tree line where the ground was flat enough. I carried in food, a lantern, my sleeping bag, and a few tools. I thought about how long I would stay. A week was my plan. It seemed easy enough at first. The forest was calm. The air was cool. The sound of birds came from all directions, and the breeze hissed through the trees. The first hours passed easily. I stacked some wood by the stove, boiled water on a small camp stove I brought, and sat on the porch with a can of food. The silence after the sun dipped low surprised me. It was a kind of quiet I had never felt before. In town, there was always some hum, some distant car, a dog barking. Here, it was different. The silence pressed in on me, and I could hear my own heartbeat when I stood still. That night, I lit the lantern and set it on the table. The shadows filled the corners of the room, and every so often I heard faint cracks and pops from the wood stove as the logs shifted. I told myself this was what I wanted. A quiet place to sleep, a break from constant movement. But as the night grew deeper, the noises outside began to stand out. The first noise was faint. Something snapped out in the trees, not close but not far. It sounded like a footstep on a dry branch. My shoulders tensed. I waited for another sound. After a while, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the woods. But after another 20 minutes, I heard it again, this time closer. A definite crack, followed by a slow crunch in the leaves. I stood near the window and tried to look out. The lantern inside only reflected against the glass, and outside was pitch black. I turned the lantern down low and pressed my face close. I saw only my faint outline and the deep shapes of trees. No movement. I sat back down at the table, but my ears stayed sharp. I counted each small sound, each rustle, each faint shift outside. After a long stretch of silence, I finally lay on the bed, though I did not fall asleep quickly. I stayed awake for a long time, listening to the wind push against the walls, the old boards creak, and the occasional snap of something out in the dark. When I did sleep, I woke often. Once I woke to the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. It was faint but deliberate, like a slow drag along the wall. I froze on the bed, holding my breath. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, counting heartbeats until it passed. By morning, the fear seemed distant. The light made the cabin seem smaller, harmless. I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was damp from a light rain. The dirt road that led up here was empty, and the trees stood quiet and heavy. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for tracks. In the soft ground near the back wall, I saw a clear mark. It was a boot print, not mine. The tread was deep and sharp, pressed into the wet dirt. It pointed toward the wall of the cabin, just below the window of the main room. I crouched there, staring at it. I had only arrived yesterday, and I had not seen anyone on the road or near the property. This place was supposed to be far from traffic, far from other cabins. My chest felt tight. I looked around the trees, expecting someone to be standing there watching. Nothing, only tall pines and the distant rush of wind. The rest of the day, I could not relax. I stayed close to the cabin, checking the trees often, scanning the dirt road for signs of anyone. I had no cell signal out here, only a small emergency radio in my pack. I thought about leaving right then, but the car was my only way down the hill, and the idea of walking back to it alone made me hesitate. I told myself it might have been an old boot print, left by someone before me. Still, I checked the door lock several times and dragged a chair under the handle before I slept that night. Sleep was worse. I woke up to the faint sound of movement on the porch. A slow step, the wood creaking under weight. My throat went dry, and I lay frozen in bed. Another creak followed, closer to the door. I wanted to move, to get up, but my body felt heavy. I reached slowly for the lantern and turned the knob just enough to let a weak light glow. The sound stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, holding the lantern, staring at the door. The chair I had wedged under the handle was still in place. Nothing happened after that. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep, though every sound pulled me awake again. By morning, I opened the door and looked at the porch. A faint muddy mark was near the step. Another boot print angled toward the door. It was fresher than the one behind the cabin. I felt trapped. Leaving meant walking the road with my back exposed. Staying meant waiting in the cabin for whoever was out there to come closer. I thought about ways to secure the place. I moved some of the heavier furniture near the windows. I stacked wood against the inside of the door. I even took out the hatchet I had brought for chopping kindling and kept it close to the bed. The days stretched long, each one heavier than the last. During daylight, the forest looked empty, but I could never shake the feeling of eyes on me. At night, the sounds always returned. Footsteps around the cabin. Slow, steady movements in the leaves. A faint scrape against the wall. Once I heard what sounded like breathing outside the thin wood near my head. I sat upright on the bed, holding the hatchet, staring into the dark until my eyes burned. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, the silence playing tricks, the forest shifting with animals. But every morning I found more signs. More boot prints in the dirt, circling the cabin, stopping near windows, near the porch, sometimes in pairs as if someone had stood in one place for a long time. The fifth night was the worst. I had barely slept the night before, and exhaustion made me careless. I must have drifted off early, lantern still on the table, dim and low. A noise woke me, not outside this time, inside. A soft thud from the kitchen. My chest clenched so tight I could barely breathe. I sat up slowly, gripping the hatchet, staring at the dark doorway. The sound came again, a slow shift of weight on the old wood floor. Someone was in the cabin. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The windows were small, the door blocked by the wood I had stacked. I pressed my back to the wall, holding the hatchet with both hands. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I could make out the faint outline of a shape in the kitchen doorway. Person standing still. The figure did not move for a long time, just stood there in the dark. Then slowly a step forward. The floor creaked under the weight. Another step. My hands shook as I gripped the hatchet tighter. I forced myself to act. I swung the lantern bright and lifted the hatchet, stepping forward with all the strength I had. The light filled the room, and in that instant the figure turned. A man, tall, in dark clothes, face unshaven, eyes wide in the sudden light. He bolted. He moved fast, rushing back through the kitchen, out the back door I had forgotten to check. The door slammed against the frame, and I heard his boots hammering into the dirt outside. I stood frozen, shaking, my breath ragged, the hatchet heavy in my hand. When the noise faded, I finally moved. I ran to the door, slammed it shut, dragged furniture against it. I stayed awake the rest of the night, lantern burning, listening for any sound of him returning. By morning, I was done. I packed what I could into my bag, grabbed the lantern and hatchet, and forced myself out the front door. The dirt road stretched long and empty, the trees closing in on either side. I walked fast, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, heart racing with every sound of the woods. When I reached the car, I saw another set of boot prints in the dirt around it. He had been there too. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the lock and climbed inside. I started the engine, turned down the road, and did not look back. I drove until the forest thinned, until I never thought staying alone in a cabin deep in the woods would turn into something that would scar me for life. I went into it thinking it would be nothing more than a quiet retreat, a few days away from the noise of daily life, some peace, some fresh air, and maybe even a chance to clear my head. I rented the cabin for a week. It was small, old, and stood far from the nearest town. When I arrived, I realized just how cut off it really was. The dirt road leading there was rough, covered in potholes, and thick with mud in certain places. The trees leaned over the path on both sides, branches clawing at the car as I drove through. When I finally reached the cabin, I saw that it was surrounded by heavy forest on all sides. The place looked tired, like it had been sitting there too long, but at the same time it felt sturdy enough to keep me safe. At least that's what I thought. The first day was simple. I unpacked my things, set up some food in the kitchen, and walked around the property. There was no phone service at all, not even a single bar. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no television, and the radio only picked up a few static-filled stations. I figured it would force me to disconnect and just enjoy being alone. I had brought books, a journal, and a fishing rod since there was a small creek a short walk down the slope behind the cabin. The silence was heavier than I expected. At first, it felt calming, like wrapping myself in a thick blanket. But after the sun went down and the woods turned black, the silence began to feel different. Every creak of the wood, every faint sound outside, every gust of wind against the roof carried more weight than it should have. I tried not to let it bother me. That first night, I sat by the small wood stove, ate a simple dinner, and read until I felt tired enough to sleep. The bed was small, the mattress thin, and the cabin seemed to groan and shift in the cold night air. I pulled the blanket tight around me and drifted off. I remember waking up once, deep in the night, to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just the crunch of leaves, maybe an animal. I forced myself not to think about it and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I felt fine. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and breathed in the cold, sharp air. The forest looked endless, stretching in every direction. The ground was damp from dew, and birds moved in the branches overhead. I tried to enjoy it, but I couldn't stop glancing at the trees, as if something might step out from them. I shook the thought away. It was nothing, just me getting used to being isolated. I spent the day exploring a little. I followed the creek for a while, fished, and managed to catch a couple of small trout. I cooked them later for dinner. The sun went down faster than I expected. By the time I got back to the cabin, the woods were already sinking into shadow. I realized how quickly darkness takes over when there are no streetlights, no glow from nearby houses, no sound of cars in the distance, just blackness swallowing everything. That night, the sounds outside were clearer. Something brushed against the cabin wall. At first, I thought it was a tree branch, but when I checked in the morning, there was no tree close enough to reach the wall. There were marks on the ground, too, deep impressions in the soil, not shaped like boots, but not the clean prints of a deer either. They looked like someone had walked in circles near the cabin, but the steps were uneven, dragging in places. My chest tightened when I saw that. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a bear or a moose had wandered close during the night. The dragging marks could have been from it moving slowly or brushing something across the ground. I tried to believe it, but I couldn't. The steps looked too much like human tracks, only not quite right. The following night was worse. I went to bed early, but I woke again around 2 in the morning. This time, the sound was heavier, like slow steps pressing into the ground outside. Then came a scrape along the wall, steady and deliberate. I froze in bed, not even breathing. My body went stiff, ears straining. I waited for it to pass, but it didn't. The scraping went on for a while, moving from one side of the cabin to another. Then silence. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I stayed like that, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for hours until I finally passed out from exhaustion. When daylight came, I checked outside again. The ground near the walls was more torn up. There were definite prints this time, too long and too narrow to be normal. Some dragged deep, others barely touched the surface. I saw where something had stood near the window, right beneath it, as if watching in. That thought sent a cold wave through me. I thought about packing up and leaving right then. But the idea of driving that rough road in panic didn't sit well with me. It would take nearly an hour to reach the nearest main road, and then longer to find town. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I locked the door, boarded up the thinner windows with extra what I found stacked behind the cabin, and tried to calm down. I still had several days left, and I told myself I could make it. The next nights turned into a blur of fear. I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The steps, the scraping, sometimes a faint tapping on the walls. Once, I thought I heard the faint squeak of the door handle moving, like someone testing it. I pushed a chair against the door after that. On the 5th night, it escalated. The noises started earlier, just after midnight. I was sitting near the wood stove, staring at the flames, when something heavy struck the side of the cabin. The whole wall shook. I jumped, my pulse spiking. Then came another strike, then silence. I held the fire poker in my hand, gripping it until my knuckles ached. I sat there all night, waiting for something to break through, but nothing did. By morning, I was drained, shaky, and sick to my stomach from the constant stress. I stepped outside carefully, looking around the clearing. The air was cold and damp, the ground soft with dew. The prints were everywhere now, circling the cabin, dragging lines through the mud, stopping at windows and doors. It was no animal. I knew that now. Someone had been out there every night, watching, testing, waiting. I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my things as fast as I could, shoving them into my bags without care. My plan was simple. Get in the car, drive down the dirt road, and don't look back. But when I reached the spot where I had parked the car, my chest turned to stone. The tires were slashed, shredded into ribbons. The car sagged onto the rims, useless. I felt the blood drain from my face. My only way out was gone. Panic hit me so hard I had to lean against the car to stop from collapsing. Someone had done this while I slept, while I was inside trying to convince myself it was all in my head. They had been close enough, long enough to destroy my only chance of escape. And I hadn't heard a thing. I stumbled back to the cabin, my mind racing. I had no phone service, no working car, no weapon other than kitchen knives and a fire poker. I had food for maybe 3 more days and the creek water if I boiled it. But I couldn't last here forever, not with someone stalking me. That day dragged on endlessly. Every sound outside twisted my stomach. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see someone standing at the tree line. By nightfall, my nerves were raw. I blocked the door with everything heavy I could move, the table, the chair, even the mattress from the bed. I kept the fire poker close and sat in the corner, shaking. The night was worse than all the others. The strikes against the cabin started again, harder this time, shaking the walls. Something scraped against the roof. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. The door creaked as pressure pushed against it. I held the poker tight, my breath shallow. Then silence. Hours of silence. I sat awake until morning, waiting for the door to break, but it never did. When daylight came, I knew I had no choice. I couldn't sit and wait to be hunted down. I packed a bag with food, a bottle for water, a knife and matches. I was going to hike out. I didn't know exactly how far the main road was, but I figured if I kept heading east, I would eventually reach it. I couldn't stay another night. I left the cabin that morning, locking the door behind me even though I knew it was useless. I walked fast, forcing myself not to look back. The woods felt endless, every tree looking the same, every sound making me spin around in fear. I followed the sun, trying to keep my bearings, but the forest swallowed all sense of direction. By midday, I was already exhausted. My legs burned, my back ached under the pack, and my throat was dry. I stopped at the creek to refill water, boiled it quickly over a fire, and pushed on. But as the hours stretched on, I realized I was not making much progress. The woods seemed to twist, pulling me back on myself. Then I saw it. Ahead, through the trees, the cabin. My cabin. My chest locked up. Somehow, after hours of walking, I had circled right back to where I started. My knees nearly gave out when I saw the sagging roof and boarded windows. I had rented the cabin because I thought I needed time away from everything. I wanted silence, a place to think, and somewhere no one could bother me. It was tucked into the woods, about 30 minutes off a narrow back road that itself was far from any highway. The listing had promised peace, no neighbors in sight, no noise but the trees and animals. At the time, that sounded perfect. I had no idea how the silence would feel when night came, or how quickly I would regret choosing such a place. The road that led to it was hardly a road at all. It was more of a path carved into dirt, winding between thick trees, uneven, filled with dips and ruts. My car shook over every bump, and branches scraped the sides. The drive alone gave me a feeling that I was heading into something I shouldn't. When I finally reached the cabin, it sat in a clearing no larger than a couple 100 feet across. Trees rose high and tight all around, their shadows swallowing the edges of the clearing even while daylight still lingered. The cabin itself was simple, weathered wood siding, a sagging roof, a porch with 2 steps and a railing that leaned slightly. The windows were old and cloudy, the kind you couldn't see through unless you pressed your face to the glass. There was no cell signal, no other houses, no lights except the ones inside. That first evening, I unloaded my bags and set them inside by the couch. The air inside was stale, carrying that old wood smell mixed with dust. There was a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with running water that sputtered from old pipes. Nothing fancy, just walls, a roof, and enough space for me to be alone. During the day, it felt calm. Birds called from the woods. Sunlight stretched across the clearing. The sounds of nature filled the space in a way that was relaxing, almost pleasant. I chopped wood for the small stove in the kitchen, walked a bit into the trees, and tried to enjoy the quiet. I told myself this was what I wanted. Time to think, time to breathe. But I didn't realize then that I was already uneasy. I kept looking back at the cabin every time I walked a little too far. I noticed how small it looked against the wall of trees, and how the forest seemed to close in tighter the farther I went. That night, everything changed. When the sun went down, the woods outside the cabin turned into something completely different. It wasn't just dark. It was a kind of darkness that felt heavy, pressing against the windows, creeping under the door. I lit the old oil lamp the owner had left, and its weak glow barely lit the room. The silence was so thick that I could hear every creak of the wood, every drip of water in the sink, every tiny shift of the cabin's frame. Then the noises started. First, it was just small things. A crack of a twig outside, a faint rustle of leaves, things you'd expect in the woods. But then came the sharper sounds. Heavy steps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the window where the lamplight ended. I froze the first time I heard it, sitting on the couch, straining my ears. The steps didn't sound like a deer or a raccoon. They were steady, spaced too far apart, too heavy, like boots pressing into soil. I held my breath, listening. They moved around the cabin slowly, circling. My chest tightened, and I felt heat rising to my face as if the air was thinning. I tried to tell myself it could be a hunter, maybe someone lost, but that didn't make sense. There was no car, no sign of anyone, and the way the steps moved, they didn't wander. They paced. They circled once, twice, stopping now and then starting again. I sat frozen until the sound stopped. Minutes passed, then an hour, and I didn't move from the couch. I barely breathed, afraid to make noise. When I finally forced myself to check the door, I found the handle cold under my hand, the lock flimsy. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening, but outside was silent again. That first night, I barely slept. I left the lamp burning and sat against the wall in the bedroom, staring at the window, my mind racing. Every creak in the cabin felt like something moving. Every brush of wind against the siding felt like someone's hand. By morning, I was exhausted, but at least the light returned. Sunlight filled the clearing, and with it came the illusion of safety. I tried to convince myself I had imagined the steps. Maybe I had been on edge, hearing things, letting my mind turn ordinary noises into something else. But when I stepped outside, the ground told a different story. The dirt around the cabin was soft from recent rain, and in the soil were prints. Not animal tracks, shoe prints, large, heavy. They circled the cabin, just like I had heard. I followed them a little way into the trees, but they disappeared into the leaves and brush. My stomach dropped, and I backed away quickly, my eyes scanning the trees. Someone had been out there. Someone had walked around and watched while I sat inside. I spent that day with a constant weight on my chest. I tried to keep busy, chopping more wood, sweeping out the cabin, even reading one of the old books left on a shelf, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the windows. Every sound outside made my skin prickle. I debated leaving, but the thought of driving back down that long dirt road in the dark woods didn't feel safer. I told myself I'd wait until morning, then leave. One more night. The second night was worse. I had built a small fire in the stove and sat close to it, trying to block out my fear with the sound of crackling wood. For hours, nothing happened. The woods were silent, heavy with stillness. Then came the sound again, those steps slow and measured. This time, closer, bolder. I held my breath, my heart slamming against my ribs. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing at the window. The old glass made faint ticking sounds as if something brushed against it. I didn't dare move. My muscles locked up, and sweat dripped down my neck. Then I heard the door handle. It was faint at first, just the soft rattle of metal, then firmer. A slow twist. Someone was trying it. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath shallow. The lock held, but the sound of it being tested over and over filled the cabin. After what felt like forever, the rattling stopped. The steps moved again around the porch, then off into the woods. I sat shaking, every muscle tight, my ears straining for the faintest sound. Hours dragged by before I felt sure they were gone. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, throwing my things into bags with clumsy hands. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped again. My car sat in the clearing, and on the hood was a smear of dirt, as though a hand had pressed against it. On the windshield, faint streaks like someone had dragged their fingers across the glass. My throat tightened. Whoever had been out there hadn't just circled the cabin. They had touched my car, close enough to know I was leaving. I forced myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands shook on the wheel as I backed out. The dirt path felt narrower than before, the trees pressing in on both sides. Every shadow looked like someone standing. My eyes darted to the mirrors again and again, half expecting to see a figure step into view. For miles, the road twisted through the forest, and with each turn, I felt the panic rise higher. When I finally reached the paved road, I didn't stop. I drove until I saw houses, until I saw people, until the woods were far behind me. Only then did I let myself breathe fully. I never went back for the rest of the week I had paid for. I left the cabin owner a message saying there had been problems and that I wouldn't be staying. I didn't explain. I didn't want to explain. I just knew I had been watched. Someone had been out there, circling in the dark, testing the door, touching my car. And if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have left that place at all. I had been meaning to get away for a while. Work had been grinding me down, and the noise of the city was always in my head even when I tried to sleep. A friend had told me about a cabin that sat up in the hills, past a rough stretch of forest roads that most people avoided. It was old but solid, sitting on land that hadn't been touched much in years. He said it was the kind of place where you could sit for days and hear nothing but the sound of wind moving through trees. That was what I needed, or at least what I thought I needed. I left early in the morning with the back of my truck filled with supplies. I didn't want to be short of anything because the closest small town was almost an hour away once you got down the dirt road. I had food, water, a couple of extra fuel cans, batteries, a lantern, and even a small generator. The plan was simple: spend a few days out there, relax, clear my head, and drive back when I was ready. The drive into the hills took longer than I expected. The paved road turned to gravel, then the gravel to dirt, and then finally to what felt like nothing more than a path cut through the trees. I kept having to slow down because the truck bounced and shook over rocks and ruts. After about an hour of that, the cabin finally came into view. It was smaller than I pictured, just one story with a steep roof and a small porch that sagged slightly. The windows were dusty and streaked from rain. There was a thin chimney, though I doubted it had been used in a long time. I parked in front and sat for a moment before getting out. The trees pressed in tight around the clearing, tall pines and bare branches that moved against each other with a sound that carried strangely. There wasn't another house or cabin in sight. No sign of other people at all, just the quiet. Inside, the cabin smelled stale. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung in corners. There was a small kitchen with an old stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow hallway with 1 bedroom and a tiny bathroom. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to sweep dust from the floor and open the windows. Cold air came through, sharper than I expected, carrying the smell of damp wood and earth. By late afternoon, I had things set up. The generator gave me a little power, enough to run a light if I needed it, though I kept it off most of the time to save fuel. I built a fire in the wood stove and sat in front of it, listening to the small pops and cracks. It felt strange at first to sit without anything to do. No phone buzzing, no people outside, just silence. But the longer I sat there, the more it grew on me. The first night passed without much trouble. I woke up a few times because of noises outside, branches moving, maybe animals. I wasn't used to how loud the forest could sound when everything else was quiet. But nothing happened. The second day, I spent wandering the woods around the cabin. The ground was damp and soft in places, and my boots sank into patches of mud. I found what looked like an old trail that ran deeper into the trees, but it was overgrown and hard to follow. There were broken branches here and there, and places where the ground seemed pressed down, but it could have been deer or other animals. That night, though, something felt different. I was sitting at the table with a lantern burning low when I heard it. A crunch outside, not like a branch falling, but something stepping. Slow, steady, then stopping. I froze. The cabin walls were thin, and sound carried too easily. I waited, listening so hard my ears rang, but it went quiet again. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer moving around. I went to bed, though I didn't sleep much. Every time the wind moved the trees, I thought I heard steps. Every time a branch scratched against the roof, I thought it was something else. On the third morning, I went out to check around the cabin. The ground was soft from rain, and I noticed something I hadn't before. Prints. Not boot prints, but shoes, faint but clear enough in the mud near the tree line. They weren't mine. They led toward the cabin but then turned back. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My stomach tightened in a way that was hard to explain. It could have been an old print from when someone else came here, but the edges weren't washed out. They looked recent. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe a hunter passing through, maybe someone cutting across the woods. But the thought stayed in my head all day, heavy, making me jump at small sounds. That night, I kept the lantern burning longer than before. I sat up with my back to the wall, staring at the door, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Steps slow in the leaves outside, coming closer, then stopping. I didn't move. My chest felt tight. The steps didn't come again, but I knew something had been out there. In the morning, I checked again. This time, there were more prints, clearer, closer to the porch. I could see the tread from the shoes, not boots, just regular shoes. Whoever it was had come closer than before, then turned back. That was when I started to feel real fear. Not the kind of fear that comes and goes, but the kind that settles in your stomach and stays. Someone was out there, and they were coming close at night. I thought about leaving, but I had driven far to get here, and part of me didn't want to believe it was anything more than bad luck. Maybe kids messing around, though I hadn't seen a house for miles. Maybe a hiker lost, though hikers didn't wander around cabins at night without knocking. Still, I decided to be careful. I kept the generator off at night so the light wouldn't draw attention. I stayed quiet, barely moving once the sun went down. The fourth night was worse. I had just started to drift off when a noise snapped me awake. A soft creak. The porch. I held my breath, listening, and there it was again. Slow weight pressing on wood. My hands shook. Someone was right outside. I didn't move from the bed. I stared at the ceiling, every muscle locked. After a while, the creak stopped, and I heard steps moving away. I stayed awake until dawn, not daring to sleep. When I went out in the morning, the prints were on the porch itself. Whoever it was had stood right at the door. That was when I knew I couldn't stay. I started packing my things, shoving supplies into bags, not caring about order. But the more I packed, the more I realized how far it was back down the road, how long it would take to drive out. If whoever was out there was watching, they'd see me leave. I didn't like that idea, so I waited through the day, thinking maybe I'd leave at first light. I kept the door locked, though the lock was little more than a thin piece of metal that wouldn't stop anyone determined. The fifth night came, and I sat with my back against the wall, a heavy flashlight in my hand, waiting. Started the same. Steps in the leaves. Slow, careful, circling. Then the porch again, the wood creaking. This time the sound stayed. Someone was standing there. I felt sweat run down my face. The doorknob rattled, just once, lightly. Not enough to open, but enough to let me know it was being tested. I gripped the flashlight, ready to swing it if the door came open, but after a long moment the sound stopped. Silence settled, heavy and endless. When dawn came, I went out again. The prints covered the porch now. Clear, fresh. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time. That was enough. I couldn't stay another night. I loaded the truck as fast as I could. My hands shook so badly I dropped things more than once. I kept looking at the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there, but it stayed empty. When I finally drove out, the tires slipping in the mud, I didn't look back at the cabin. The road felt longer on the way down, every turn tighter, every bump louder. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing. When I hit pavement again, I didn't stop. I drove until I was back in town, until I saw people and lights and noise again. Even then, I couldn't shake it. The image of those prints, clear in the mud, circling the cabin night after night. The thought of someone standing on the porch in the dark, testing the door, waiting. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't tell my friend what happened either. I just said it wasn't for me. But the truth was simple. Someone had been out there. Someone who never said a word, who never showed their face, who just stood in the dark and waited. And that was enough to make me leave for good. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. It wasn't anything special, at least not on paper. But for me, it was a way to get out of the same daily routine I had been stuck in for too long. I had found a small cabin listed for rent deep in the woods of a northern state. The kind of place that didn't come with many extras but promised seclusion and quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't after luxury or entertainment. I wanted silence, a break from noise, and a place where I could step away from phones and screens. The cabin sat more than 2 hours away from the closest town, surrounded by miles of thick forest and a scattering of small lakes. The drive up was long and rough. The dirt road leading to it twisted through endless trees, and as I drove farther, the air seemed to change, cooler and sharper, with a stillness I wasn't used to. My car bounced on the uneven road, the sound of gravel hitting the underside echoing in the silence that came when I cut the engine at last. The cabin was exactly as described. A small, square building with a tin roof that was dull from years of weather. The wood siding was dark, almost black in places, and the porch sagged slightly, though it held my weight fine when I stepped onto it. Inside, it was plain but comfortable. A wood stove sat in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs stood by the window, and there was a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A counter with a sink and a small propane stove made up the kitchen area. It was enough for me. The silence hit me hardest. I didn't hear cars or people, not even distant planes overhead. Just the soft hiss of wind moving through the trees. I thought that was exactly what I needed. I unloaded my bag, set it on the bed, and walked through the place again, just letting myself get used to it. There was an outhouse a short walk behind the cabin, a small shed with a padlock, and a trail that seemed to lead down toward the lake. That first day was peaceful. I sat on the porch as the sun dropped, watching the trees shift in the evening wind. The light faded until the forest grew dark in a way city streets never do. The kind of darkness where you can't see the line between the ground and the trees. I lit a lantern inside and tried to read, but the stillness outside kept drawing my eyes to the window. By the second day, I was falling into a rhythm. I gathered some wood, started small fires in the stove to keep the chill out, and went for walks down the trail. The lake was half a mile away, calm and still with tall grass around the edge. I didn't see anyone, not even signs of another person. No cabins across the water, no boats, no voices, just water and trees. It was on the 3rd night that things started to shift. I had gone to bed early, the lantern turned off, the fire dying down to glowing coals. I woke sometime later to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. A soft crunch of leaves, a pause, another crunch. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to judge how close it was. The sound moved around the cabin slowly, like something circling. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the steps didn't seem random. They were heavy, spaced like a person walking. I waited, frozen in the dark, until they stopped. Then there was nothing. When morning came, I forced myself outside to look. The ground was covered in pine needles, and I didn't see any clear tracks. I told myself I had been half asleep, hearing things, maybe exaggerating small sounds. That explanation worked until the following night. Again, I woke to steps, slow, steady, moving just outside the walls. I could hear the weight of them on the old porch boards. I stayed still, my heart pounding, and after a while the sound faded. I didn't sleep again after that. By the 5th day, I was on edge. Every sound seemed sharp. Every shadow outside the windows made me tense. I walked farther down the trail that morning, trying to shake the feeling, and noticed something that made me stop cold. About 50 yards from the cabin, off the side of the trail, was a tree with bark stripped away at chest height. At first, I thought it was claw marks, but when I got closer, I saw it was cut, like with a knife. 3 long slices across the trunk, deep and deliberate. They weren't old either. The wood beneath was pale and fresh, not weathered. That day, I couldn't settle. I checked the shed but found it locked as before. I paced around the cabin, looking for signs that anyone had been there. Nothing clear, nothing certain, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. That night, I decided to stay awake. I kept the lantern turned low and sat at the table by the window. The forest outside was black. No moon, no stars, just a wall of dark. Hours passed, and then the sound came again. Steps in the leaves, closer, then on the porch. I held my breath and didn't move. The floorboards creaked under the weight of someone standing there. A long pause followed, and then the sound of the door handle turning slowly. The old metal clicked, but the lock held. I sat frozen, my chest tight, waiting. After a minute, the steps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. To first light, I checked the porch. The handle was smudged, faintly marked, like dirty fingers had gripped it. I stood staring at it for a long time. That day, I wanted to leave, but part of me convinced myself I was imagining too much. I had planned for a week, and I didn't want to cut it short. The 6th night was worse. I had barely fallen asleep when I woke to a loud crack outside, like a branch snapping. I sat up, heart racing, listening. The steps came again, moving quicker this time, around the cabin, across the porch, then stopping. For what felt like hours, I heard nothing else. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed of someone standing in the room, watching. The 7th day, I was a wreck. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, my nerves were shot, and every time the wind moved branches, I jumped. I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my bag, loaded the car, and tried to drive out. But less than 2 miles down the dirt road, I found a tree across it, not fallen by storm, but cut. The trunk was cleanly sawn, angled, blocking the road completely. I sat there staring at it, the engine idling, a sick feeling growing in me. There was no way around it. I didn't have a saw or an axe. I reversed back to the cabin, my hands shaking on the wheel. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. I sat by the fire with a kitchen knife in my hand, every muscle tight. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. Slow, circling, then closer up the porch. The handle rattled once, twice, harder this time. Then silence. I stayed frozen until dawn. On the 8th morning, I walked the trail toward the lake, desperate to clear my head. When I reached the shore, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the wet sand near the edge were prints. Not boots, not shoes, but bare feet. Large, wide, pressed deep into the mud. They led from the water up into the grass, then vanished into the trees. I went back to the cabin fast, heart hammering. The rest of the day, I kept the knife close, jumping at every sound. The sun dropped, and the dark came again. That night, I heard them return. The steps were faster, heavier. The porch boards groaned under the weight. The handle rattled, hard, shaking the whole door. Then something slammed against it once, twice. I held the knife, shaking, knowing the thin wood wouldn't last if they kept at it. Then, just as sudden as it started, it stopped. Silence. Hours passed, and nothing else came. When the first light came, I stepped outside, every part of me tense. On the porch, carved into the wood with something sharp, were words scratched deep. Stay inside. That was enough. I didn't care about the blocked road. I packed what I could carry, locked the cabin, and set out on foot. The road stretched for miles, and I walked fast, not stopping, not looking back. Every sound in the forest made me think of steps behind me. I walked until my legs burned and the sun climbed high. Finally, after hours, I reached a point where another dirt road branched off, and not long after, I heard the distant sound of an engine. When the first car appeared, I stepped out into the road, waving wildly until it stopped. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked about who owned the land or why that tree had been cut. or whose feet those were by the lake. I left it all behind, but even now, at night, when the house is quiet and I hear the creak of wood settling, I remember the sound of those steps circling me in the dark, and I know I wasn't alone out there. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. The idea had come to me during a period when everything in my life seemed heavy and unmanageable. Work had been consuming, relationships felt shallow, and the constant noise of the city left me restless. I needed silence, or at least what I imagined silence to be. A cabin in the woods seemed perfect, isolated from everything, where I could breathe without someone's voice, without the constant pull of social obligations. I found a small place online, a single wooden cabin tucked in a forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. The reviews were minimal, but positive, describing it as quiet, secluded, and clean. It wasn't luxurious, but I didn't want luxury. I wanted something real, something removed from convenience and distraction. I left early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen. The drive was quiet, with only the faint hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees lining the road. The GPS led me along a winding route, narrow roads that became dirt paths as I neared the cabin. The further I drove, the more the air changed. It felt cleaner, cooler, and heavier at the same time. The smell of wet earth, pine, and something musky I couldn't quite place filled the air. It was refreshing but also slightly disorienting, like stepping into a place outside of time. The cabin appeared as the dirt path curved sharply between 2 groves of pine trees. It was smaller than I had imagined, a simple structure of wood with a small porch and a stone chimney. There were no neighbors visible, just the forest stretching endlessly around it. I parked my car beside the cabin and got out. The silence hit me immediately. No birds, no distant traffic, just the faint sound of the wind brushing against the branches. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying tension in it, a sense of being watched even when I was alone. I shrugged off the feeling, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being somewhere so remote. The cabin was basic but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, a single bed pushed against the far wall, and a small wood-burning stove in the corner. The walls were made of logs, and the windows were small but provided a decent view of the forest outside. I spent the first hour unpacking, arranging my supplies, and making the cabin feel like a space I could inhabit comfortably for a few days. I stacked wood beside the stove, checked the propane, and even swept the floor, though it wasn't very dirty. The ritual of preparing the space felt grounding, giving me a sense of control in a place where I expected to have little. By mid-afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was dense, with tall pines and oaks forming a thick canopy above. The ground was soft with moss, fallen leaves, and occasional patches of mud. I wandered without a clear path, just following my instincts. There was a small creek about a 10-minute walk from the cabin, its water clear but cold. I knelt at the edge, letting my fingers trail through the current. The sound of the water over the rocks was comforting, and for a moment, I let myself forget the outside world entirely. As the day progressed, I realized how isolated the cabin truly was. The forest was silent in ways that were different from the city. There was no constant hum, no predictable patterns. Instead, there were sudden sounds, branches snapping under some unseen weight, the rustle of leaves when there was no wind, distant thumps that made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was normal that animals moved through the forest constantly. Yet the sounds had a quality that made them feel deliberate, like they were happening closer than they should have been. Night came slowly, with a deepening twilight that pressed down on the forest. I built a small fire in the wood stove, the smell of burning pine filling the cabin. I had brought canned food, bread, and a small cooler of water, enough for a few days. I heated a simple meal and ate by the fire, trying to settle into the rhythm of the cabin. The first night was strange. Every noise seemed amplified, the creaking of the cabin settling, the scratching of branches against the roof, the occasional distant howl of an animal. I tried to read by flashlight, but the shadows made the room feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in. I slept poorly. The bed was firm and the pillow thin, but that wasn't the problem. It was the awareness of being alone, completely cut off. Even with the windows closed and the doors locked, I felt exposed. There were moments when I swore I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I would lie still, listening, waiting, but nothing ever appeared. By morning, I was exhausted, but I convinced myself it was just nerves. The next day, I tried to push my fears aside. I walked deeper into the forest, taking care to note landmarks in case I needed to find my way back. The terrain was rougher than I expected, with steep inclines, fallen logs, and patches of underbrush that tore at my pants. I found a small clearing, sunlight filtering through the trees in streaks, highlighting patches of wildflowers and moss. It was beautiful, almost serene, but there was something in the quiet that reminded me of the first night. I kept thinking about how quickly one could become lost out here. A wrong step, a turn in the wrong direction, and the cabin would be just a memory. That evening, I returned to the cabin, tired and sore from walking. I made another fire and ate, trying to convince myself to relax. As darkness fell, I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing visible through the window. Something or someone was moving through the trees, staying just at the limit of visibility. I froze, holding my breath. For a long time, it was impossible to tell what it was. The movements were deliberate, slow, and cautious. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the way it moved felt human-like. I checked all the locks again, even though they were already secure, and tried to make myself calm. Eventually, the figure disappeared, leaving me tense and unsettled, but unable to pinpoint what had happened. The following day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin, not daring to venture far into the forest. I spent hours observing the trees, listening to the wind, and noting every small sound. The forest was alive in ways I hadn't anticipated. Birds that sang only in bursts, small animals rustling through leaves, the wind shifting suddenly and stirring the underbrush. Every time a sound came from outside the cabin, my heart jumped. It was exhausting, the constant hyper-awareness, but I felt compelled to keep watch, as if understanding the forest would keep me safe. On the third night, the unease reached a peak. I was lying on the bed, the fire reduced to embers, when I heard footsteps again. They weren't soft, like the movements of an animal, but deliberate, heavy, pacing. I strained my eyes toward the window, heart pounding. The steps moved around the cabin perimeter, slow and methodical. I considered leaving immediately, but the thought of running into the darkness terrified me more. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, then abruptly stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, listening, too afraid to close my eyes, every nerve on edge. When morning finally arrived, I assessed the situation logically. The cabin was secure. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints that I could see. It had to be someone or something moving in the forest beyond my vision. I realized that the remoteness that had initially drawn me here was now a liability. If someone was out there with intentions to harm, there was no immediate way to call for help. The nearest town was hours away, and cell service was patchy at best. The isolation that once felt like freedom now felt like a trap. I packed essential items, leaving non-essentials behind, and decided to hike out carefully, marking a path with small stones and breaks in the underbrush to avoid getting lost. I moved cautiously, staying alert to every sound and movement. The forest seemed different in the light of day, more vibrant but still tense. I kept to high ground when possible, avoiding areas where someone or something could approach unseen. Hours passed, the physical exertion masking some of the fear, but I never lowered my guard. By the late afternoon, I reached a point where I could see the road leading back to civilization. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with exhaustion and residual fear. I emerged onto the dirt road and, seeing my car in the distance, ran the last few hundred meters, glancing constantly behind me. The cabin was left far behind, a memory that felt both oppressive and strange, like a test of endurance and perception. Back in the car, doors locked, engine running, I finally allowed myself to breathe fully. The hum of the tires on the dirt road, The familiar smells of civilization creeping in reassured me. I realized how unprepared I had been for the intensity of isolation, how easily fear could grow in the absence of other humans. Driving back toward the town, the forest receded behind me, and the tension that had built for days began to dissipate. When I returned home, I took a I drove up the old mountain road later in the day than I should have. The cabin I had rented for the week sat several miles down a rough dirt track, far away from towns and far away from people. I had chosen it that way on purpose. I wanted peace and quiet, a place where I could sit in silence, think, maybe read, and just be left alone. My life in the city had grown noisy, crowded, and stressful. I had been around people too much, hearing traffic, sirens, loud voices, and the endless background hum that comes with living in a packed place. I wanted the exact opposite. I wanted trees, wind, and the sound of nothing. The cabin was listed as being old but kept up enough for people to stay in. It didn't have running water, only a well pump outside, and it didn't have electricity beyond a small solar setup for a few lights and charging phones. That didn't bother me. I planned to rely on firewood, a propane stove, and my own supplies. I had food packed in coolers, jugs of clean drinking water, and everything else I thought I would need. The last stretch of the road was rougher than I expected. Rocks had rolled into the path, and thick branches leaned over from both sides. It felt like I was forcing my way into a place that didn't really want visitors. By the time I parked in front of the cabin, the sun was already sinking lower, and the sky had that golden glow that only lasts an hour before fading into darkness. I got out, stretched my legs, and looked around. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. Pines rose tall on all sides, their trunks straight, their needles whispering when the wind moved through them. The clearing itself was only a patch of flat ground big enough for the cabin, a narrow front porch, and the spot where I parked. There was no yard, no fence, nothing else. Just the small wooden structure and the forest pressing in close. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures online. The logs were dark from years of weather, the roof sagged a little, and the windows were small. A stack of firewood leaned against the wall. The front door had scratches around the handle, the kind that could have been from animals or just wear and tear. The porch creaked when I stepped on it. Everything smelled of damp wood and pine sap. I carried my bags inside. The interior was simple. One main room with a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and a narrow bed against the wall. The floorboards were uneven. The walls showed gaps between logs that had been stuffed with insulation, and there was a faint smell of dust and old smoke. A small shelf held a lantern, some matches, and a few basic supplies left for guests. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in before night came. My phone had no signal, which didn't surprise me. I had expected to be cut off. That was fine. That was the point. By the time I lit the lantern and got a small fire going in the stove, the forest outside was already turning black. The window showed only my own reflection in the glass. The silence was thick, heavier than anything I was used to. In the city, even at night, there's always something. Distant cars, sirens, neighbors talking. Here there was nothing. Nothing except the faint creak of the cabin and the occasional sound of wind in the trees. That first night felt uneasy, but I thought it was only because I wasn't used to it yet. I lay in the bed with my sleeping bag pulled tight and listened. Every small sound seemed bigger than it should. A branch snapped somewhere out in the woods, and I tensed. The fire popped in the stove, and I jerked my head toward it. The floor creaked as the cabin cooled and shifted, and I found myself staring at the ceiling for hours instead of sleeping. When morning came, I was relieved. The light through the window made everything seem smaller, less threatening. I made coffee on the propane stove, ate a simple breakfast, and went outside to look around. The air was cold, fresh, and sharp. The trees around the clearing were thick enough that I couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. It felt like the cabin sat inside its own private bubble. For most of the day, I read, wrote in a notebook, and tried to relax. I kept the firewood stacked, pumped some water from the well, and moved slowly through tasks that felt almost old-fashioned. It was peaceful. I told myself that the uneasy feeling from the night before would fade. But that night, it came back. It started with footsteps. I woke up sometime past midnight. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the cabin was mostly dark. My ears caught a faint crunching outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the woods. A deer maybe, or something smaller. But the sound was steady, measured, heavy. It sounded like a person walking slowly through leaves and dirt. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps circled partway around the cabin, then stopped. The silence afterward felt worse than the sound itself. I stared at the dark ceiling, heart pounding. I waited for more noise, waited for proof of what it was, but nothing came. Eventually, I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe an animal had passed by, and I had half dreamed the rest. I forced myself to close my eyes and wait for sleep again. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around carefully. The ground near the cabin was covered with old pine needles, dirt, and patches of grass. It was hard to see anything clear, but I thought I noticed what looked like a footprint pressed into the soil near the corner of the cabin. It wasn't sharp enough to be certain, but it looked like the shape of a boot. I crouched down and stared at it for a long time. I told myself it could have been left by someone else weeks ago, maybe by whoever cleaned or stocked the cabin last. Still, the uneasy feeling returned stronger. That night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps came closer. They circled, paused, then came onto the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the dark door. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, not knocking, not trying the handle, just standing. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My ears strained to hear every sound. After a long time, the boards creaked again, and the steps moved away. They faded into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle tight. By morning, my body felt weak from lack of sleep, but my mind was sharp with fear. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for tracks. I found faint impressions in the dirt leading away from the porch, disappearing into the trees. They weren't animal prints. They looked human. I thought about leaving, but the dirt road was long, rough, and twisting. Driving it in panic didn't seem safe, and part of me didn't want to admit how scared I felt. I convinced myself that maybe it was just some local person wandering by, maybe hunting or passing through. Maybe they were just curious about the cabin. But in my gut, I knew that wasn't it. The third night was the worst. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I kept the lantern burning low and the fire going strong, hoping the light would keep whoever it was away. Hours passed in silence. Then, near 2 a.m, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, circling. I sat up, every nerve screaming. The steps came closer, crunching through the leaves. They came to the porch again. The boards creaked. Then, slowly, the handle of the cabin door rattled. I froze. My eyes locked on the door, waiting for it to burst open. The handle turned and clicked, but the lock held. The person outside didn't say anything, didn't try to force it harder. They just tested it, rattled it, then stopped. For minutes, there was silence. Then I heard the sound of breathing through the crack around the door. Slow, steady breathing. They were standing right there, inches away from me, separated only by the thin wooden door. I felt sick with fear. My body shook. My mind raced. Finally, after what felt like forever, the breathing faded. The boards creaked again, and the footsteps moved off into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. When daylight came, I made my decision. I packed my bags quickly, throwing everything into the car without order. I didn't care about leaving the cabin neat. I just wanted to be gone. The dirt road out felt endless. Every turn, I expected to see someone standing in the way. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure. My hands gripped the wheel so hard they hurt. It took nearly an hour before I reached the paved road, and when I finally did, I didn't stop. I drove until I saw signs of other people, houses, and gas stations. I never went back for the deposit I left, never contacted the rental owner, never explained why I left early. I didn't want to think about it more than I had to, but even now I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Someone had been out there, watching the cabin, walking around it at night, testing the door, breathing through the cracks. They weren't lost. They weren't curious. They wanted in, and I left before they decided to try harder. I remember the exact day I arrived at the cabin. The air felt sharp with late autumn cold, the kind that cut into my lungs each time I breathed in. The gravel road that led up to it was narrow and rough, lined with tall trees that looked bare and lifeless now that their leaves had already dropped. I had to drive slow, the wheels of my old truck crunching and slipping against stones that looked like they had been there for years without being cleared. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. I passed no other vehicles, no signs of houses, nothing but endless woods and the occasional glimpse of distant ridgelines. It gave me the feeling that once I reached the cabin, I would be completely alone. That was part of the appeal, but it was also the part that weighed on me the most. The cabin belonged to a friend who had inherited it from his uncle. He had offered me the place for a few weeks since I needed time away from everything. At the time, it sounded like a good idea. No phone calls, no noise from the city, just silence and fresh air. I imagined long days of hiking and long nights of sitting by a fire with nothing to bother me. When I pulled up in front of the cabin, I saw that it was older than I had imagined. The logs looked dark and weathered, with moss clinging to the shaded sides. The roof sagged slightly near one edge, and the porch creaked loudly when I stepped onto it. I unlocked the door with the key my friend had given me, and the smell of dust and wood immediately filled my nose. Inside, the cabin was small and simple. A single main room with a fireplace on one side, a small kitchen area on the other, and a narrow hallway that led to a bathroom and a single bedroom. Everything was old but solid. Wooden chairs, a heavy table, a few shelves with tools and books stacked haphazardly. The air was cold and stale, so I opened the windows for a while to let in the fresh air. The forest outside was quiet. Too quiet, almost. I couldn't even hear birds. Just the occasional rustle of branches when the wind pushed through. I unloaded my things and stacked some firewood near the fireplace. It took me longer than I thought to get a fire going, but once it caught, the warmth spread quickly, and the shadows on the walls began to move with the flames. That first night, I sat in the chair with my boots off, listening to the wood crackle. I thought I would feel relaxed, but instead I felt restless. The silence pressed in from all sides, and I found myself straining my ears for any sound outside. A branch snapping, maybe an animal moving through the undergrowth. Sometimes I thought I heard faint crunching noises, like footsteps on leaves, but when I held my breath and listened harder, the sound was gone. When I finally went to bed, I had trouble sleeping. The mattress was thin, and the wooden frame creaked each time I shifted. The darkness in the room was heavy, the kind of darkness where you couldn't make out the walls or ceiling. I lay there staring upward, hearing the faint wind outside and occasionally the tick of cooling wood from the stove in the other room. Eventually I drifted off, though it felt shallow, more like dozing than real sleep. The next morning, I set out to explore the area around the cabin. There was a faint trail leading away from the property, so I followed it for a while. The ground was damp with fallen leaves, and the air carried the earthy smell of wet soil and rotting wood. After about half an hour of walking, I realized the trail had disappeared. I turned around, but the forest all looked the same in every direction. For a few minutes, I felt a flash of panic. My chest tightened as I thought about getting lost so close to the cabin. I forced myself to calm down, remembering the sun's position and backtracking until I found the faint impression of the trail again. That small scare stayed with me. Even when I returned safely to the cabin, I couldn't shake the thought of how easy it would be to lose myself out there. No one would know. No one would find me quickly. The woods stretched on for miles, and there wasn't another house for several miles in any direction. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about how fragile the situation really was. I told myself I just needed to adjust, that it was normal to feel unsettled the first couple of days. Over the next few nights, though, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. First, it was small things. I would hear the crunch of something heavy moving outside in the dark. Then nothing. I told myself it was just deer or maybe a bear passing through. Another time, I found fresh scuff marks near the side of the cabin in the morning, like the ground had been disturbed. Could have been an animal digging, I thought, but the marks looked too wide, too deliberate. I tried to ignore it, though the pit in my stomach got heavier each time. One night, I was sitting in the chair with the fire nearly burned down to glowing embers when I heard something distinctly different. It wasn't just a branch falling or an animal moving. It was a steady sound, like someone stepping carefully on the porch outside. The boards creaked once, then silence. I sat frozen, staring at the dark window, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move for what felt like an hour, listening, waiting for the sound again. It never came. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it, though my body stayed tense long after. I slept poorly again that night, waking every hour to listen. The following morning, I walked around the cabin. I found nothing unusual, except for the faint outline of what looked like a boot print near the corner of the porch. It was pressed into the damp earth, partially smudged. Could have been mine, but I didn't remember stepping there. I stared at it longer than I should have, trying to decide, before shaking it off. Still, the thought lingered that someone else might have been there. The days dragged on. I tried to keep myself busy by chopping wood, cooking simple meals, and reading from the dusty books left on the shelves. But the nights were the worst. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. Every faint noise outside had me sitting up, straining to listen. The isolation that I thought I wanted now felt suffocating. My world shrank to the walls of the cabin and the endless dark forest outside. One night, the noises outside came again. This time, it was more than a single creak. It was a slow, dragging sound against the wall, like something being pulled across the logs. I sat up in bed, every muscle tight. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping a heavy piece of firewood in my hand like a weapon. When the daylight came, I went outside and searched the area. There were faint scratches on the wood of the cabin, low to the ground. They didn't look like claw marks. They looked like something had been dragged along the wall deliberately. The fear settled in deeper after that. Each night felt like a test of how long I could endure the silence, the waiting, the not knowing. I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving down that long, empty road in the middle of the night seemed worse. I told myself I would wait until morning, then pack and leave. But each morning, the daylight made me feel a little safer, like maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought, and I convinced myself to stay. On the 10th night, everything came to a head. I had been lying in bed for hours, unable to sleep, when I heard the unmistakable sound of the door handle moving. It rattled slowly, as if someone was testing it. My body went rigid. The fire in the other room had already burned low, so the cabin was almost completely dark. I sat up, staring at the door, my chest pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The handle moved again, more forcefully this time, then stopped. For the rest of the night, I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the door until the faint light of morning crept through the cracks in the curtains. When I finally stepped outside, I found fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch, clearer this time. They were boots larger than mine, and there were several of them circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. This wasn't an animal. This was a person, and they had been watching me for nights, testing the cabin. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed my things as fast as I could, throwing them into the truck with shaking hands. Every sound in the forest made me whip my head around, convinced someone was about to step out from behind a tree. When I finally started the engine, the sound felt deafening in the silence. I drove down that long gravel road faster than I should have, glancing constantly at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road behind me. When I reached the highway, I didn't stop driving until I saw the first town. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the truck for nearly an hour, just breathing, just letting the tension drain out of me. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't go back to the cabin. The thought of it still makes my skin crawl. In the end, it was clear to me what had been happening. Someone had been out there in the woods, watching me. Maybe they had seen the cabin as an easy target. Maybe they just enjoyed the game of it. I would never know. What I did know was that if I had stayed one more night, if I had ignored that rattling door handle, I might not have made it out. That cabin taught me how fragile isolation really is, and how sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't the silence, but the knowledge that you're not as alone as you think. I remember the first time I drove down the rough dirt road that led to the cabin. The trees leaned over both sides of the narrow path, their branches so thick that in some places they blocked out most of the sunlight. The air smelled heavy with pine and damp earth. My truck shook from side to side as the wheels dipped into deep ruts left by years of rain and snow runoff. I had rented the place for a week, wanting time away from noise, work, and people. I told myself it would be peaceful. The listing had shown a small wooden cabin by a lake, with no neighbors nearby, just woods stretching in every direction. That was exactly what I thought I wanted. The cabin looked simple when I pulled up. The logs were dark from age and weather. The roof sloped with patches of moss clinging to the shingles. A small porch ran along the front, with two old wooden chairs that looked like they had been sitting there for decades. There was no sound except the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional call of a bird somewhere far off. The stillness hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to silence like that. Even when I thought I was alone at home in the city, there was always something humming. A car going by, voices drifting through a wall. Out here, there was nothing. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. The air was cool and still. There was one main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area with a stove that looked older than me, and a bedroom off to the side. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom that had a small window that barely let in light. The floor creaked under my steps as if it had grown stiff from holding itself together too long. The windows were old too, some with faint cracks around the edges of the glass. I set my bag down on the wooden floor and felt a strange weight settle over me. I told myself it was just the silence. That first evening, I unpacked slowly. I had brought food, water, and enough supplies to stay inside if the weather turned bad. The sky dimmed early because of the trees, and the shadows around the cabin stretched longer until the whole place seemed wrapped in gray. I lit a lantern I had brought. Since the cabin didn't have steady power, only an old generator in the shed out back. I didn't want to use it unless I had to, so I kept to the lantern's circle of light. The glow barely reached the corners of the room, leaving them dark and heavy. That night I tried to sleep, but every sound woke me. Branches brushed the cabin roof. The walls groaned as if shifting against the cold. Once, I heard a noise outside, like a crunch of footsteps on gravel. But when I sat up and held my breath, there was nothing. The silence after the noise was worse than the noise itself. My heart wouldn't slow down for what felt like hours. Eventually, I must have drifted off. But when I woke again, it was with the gray light of morning bleeding in through the cracks in the blinds. The days started to follow a rhythm. I would walk along the edge of the lake, chop some wood for the fireplace, and write in a notebook I had brought. I wanted to keep track of the days, to mark what I saw, what I felt. But the silence never left. The only sounds were my own movements and the rare snap of a branch in the woods. I couldn't shake the sense that when I wasn't looking, the trees stood closer, pressing in tighter around the cabin. By the third day, I had begun to notice small details that bothered me. The first was the lock on the front door. It was new, shiny, and strong, while everything else in the cabin looked decades old. The second was the window in the bedroom. On the inside, the frame was scratched, deep grooves in the wood as if someone had tried to claw it open from within. I ran my fingers over the marks again and again, telling myself it could have been from furniture being dragged too close, or maybe an animal that had gotten in once. But the marks didn't look random. They looked desperate. That night, the noises outside grew louder. I heard crunching in the leaves, closer this time, moving slowly around the cabin. My chest tightened as I lay in the dark, listening. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They paused, shifted, and then scraped against the porch. My hand reached for the heavy flashlight I had on the nightstand. I wanted to open the door and shine it outside, but the thought of actually seeing what was there held me back. I stayed in bed, holding the flashlight against my chest, not sleeping until the gray light of morning returned. When I finally stepped outside, the porch boards creaked under my weight. That was when I noticed it. The dirt in front of the porch had marks in it. Not clear footprints, but depressions, like someone had stood there for a long time, shifting their weight. I crouched down, staring at them until my eyes watered from the strain. The ground was too dry to show clear shapes, but I knew those weren't animal tracks. The next few days dragged in slow tension. Every sound outside seemed closer than before. I began to feel watched, as if the trees themselves were hiding eyes. I caught myself glancing at the windows more often, expecting a face to appear in the glass. At night, the steps on the porch returned. I lay awake and listened to the boards groan, each slow creak heavier than the last. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe a hunter lost in the woods. Maybe someone living off the land. But then I remembered the scratches on the window frame, and the thought of someone trapped inside the cabin before me burned into my mind. By the fifth night, I had stopped sleeping much at all. My body ached from lying tense, waiting. I stacked furniture against the bedroom door, though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted in. The generator remained off. I didn't want its noise to cover up the sounds outside. I needed to hear everything. The food I brought barely left the kitchen table anymore. My appetite shrank with the fear twisting in my gut. On the sixth morning, I found something new. Near the shed, in the soft earth, were clearer marks. Footprints, bare feet, longer than mine, pressed deep into the ground as if whoever left them was heavy. I stood frozen, staring at them, my breath fogging in the cold air. They led from the trees, around the back of the cabin, and then vanished into the thicker woods. I thought about leaving that day. I even packed some of my bag, loading water bottles and food into it. But the road back was long and rough, miles of dirt and trees before I would reach anything like a highway. I told myself I could handle one more night, just one. I didn't want to believe I was being driven out of the place by something unseen. That last night was the worst. The noises began earlier, just after sunset. The crunching of steps circled the cabin again and again, closer each time. Then came a sound on the wall, a dragging noise, as if something rough was being pulled against the wood. I gripped the flashlight so hard my hand hurt. My chest felt like it was caving in as I waited for the sound to stop. But it didn't. It grew louder, then shifted to the window near the bed. I didn't dare look. The scratches came next. Slow, steady scraping on the glass, as if something sharp was tracing lines across it. My breath came in short gasps. I wanted to run out the door into the night, but the thought of stepping outside with whoever was there stopped me cold. I pulled the blankets over myself even though I knew they couldn't protect me. The scratching went on for what felt like hours, until finally, at some point, I blacked out from exhaustion. When I woke, the cabin was bright with daylight. My body shook as I forced myself up. The window by the bed was streaked with fresh marks, thin lines carved into the glass but not broken through. I gathered my things without eating, without thinking. I carried my bag out to the truck and didn't look back until I was on the road, trees closing in behind me. Took hours before I reached the highway, and even then I didn't feel safe. My hands stayed tight on the wheel, eyes darting to the mirrors as if something had followed me out. The silence of the cabin clung to me, heavy and sharp. I never reported it. I didn't know what to say. That someone or something had circled the cabin at night, left footprints, scratched at the glass, and stood watching for hours. No one would believe me, but I know what I heard, what I saw. The cabin is still there, I'm sure, waiting, and I can't stop thinking about the scratches inside the window frame. Someone before me had tried to get out. I came to the cabin because I wanted quiet. The weeks before had been nothing but noise, stress, and too many people. I thought being far away from everything, tucked into a part of the woods that hardly anyone used, would give me what I needed. The place wasn't even mine. It belonged to a friend's uncle who used it mostly in hunting season, but I was told it was empty for months at a time, so when I asked if I could stay there for a week, nobody had a problem with it. I didn't ask many questions about the area, and I didn't look up much either. I figured a cabin was a cabin and woods were woods. All I wanted was to be away from the world. The drive out was longer than I expected. I took a highway, then a two-lane road, then a dirt track that seemed to go on forever. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, my car looked like it had rolled through mud for hours, and the branches had scraped up the sides. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined. It was built of rough wood, with a tin roof and a porch that sagged in the middle. There was no sign of life anywhere around it. No cars, no tire tracks, no footprints. Just trees pressed close on all sides. I could barely see the sky through the canopy. Inside, it smelled like old wood, dust, and a faint trace of mildew. There were two small rooms. One was the kitchen and living space combined, with a wood stove, a little counter, and a table with two chairs. The other was the bedroom, with a single bed and a dresser. A few hooks on the walls still had old jackets hanging from them, stiff with age. The place wasn't pretty, but it would do. I dropped my bags on the floor, opened the few windows to let the air change, and felt glad I was finally away from everything. The first day passed without anything strange. I unpacked, swept the floor, and stacked some wood near the stove. I had brought food in a cooler, nothing fancy, mostly cans and packaged stuff. That evening, I sat on the porch and listened to the woods settle. It was quieter than the city, but not silent. The trees creaked, bugs hummed, and once in a while I could hear something larger moving in the brush. Probably deer, I told myself. When darkness came, it came hard. Out here, there were no streetlights, no glow from houses nearby. Once the sun was gone, the trees turned into a solid wall of black. I lit the old lantern inside and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The first few nights followed the same pattern. I woke up with the sunrise, cooked simple food, walked a little way down the dirt track, and returned to sit on the porch. Sometimes I wrote in the notebook I had brought. I didn't bring much else. My phone barely had a signal, so I left it off most of the time. I thought I was starting to unwind, but by the fourth night, I noticed something that set a small crack in the calm I had been building. I had just blown out the lantern and lay in bed when I heard footsteps on the porch. At first, I thought it was an animal. The boards creaked under weight, and I told myself maybe a raccoon had climbed up. But these weren't the light, quick taps of an animal. They were slow, heavy, careful. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The sound moved across the porch, then stopped right outside the front door. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I waited, not daring to move. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. I didn't hear steps going back down the porch. I didn't hear anything move away into the woods. It was as if whatever had been there had just vanished into thin air. I lay awake for hours, ears straining, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I told myself it had to have been my imagination. Maybe we'd shifted with the night air. Maybe I dreamed it. But when I went outside, I saw marks in the dirt at the bottom of the porch steps. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots. Clear tread marks pressed into the soft ground. Someone had walked up to the cabin in the middle of the night. I stood there staring at them, my skin crawling. The tracks came from the tree line, went straight up the steps, and stopped on the porch. I searched for more, but there were none leading away. Whoever it was had either walked backward into the woods or stayed long enough to cover their tracks. I didn't like either thought. All day I felt uneasy. Every creak of the cabin, every sound in the woods made me jump. I told myself maybe it was a hunter passing through. Maybe they thought the cabin was empty, but deep down I didn't believe it. Hunters don't sneak up to cabins at night and stand outside the door without saying anything. That night, I bolted the door, closed the shutters, and kept the lantern burning longer than usual. I tried to read, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. When I finally lay down, sleep came in fits. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound again. This time, it wasn't footsteps on the porch. It was scratching along the side of the cabin. Slow, dragging scratches, as if someone was running a stick or a knife along the wood. The noise circled the cabin, moving from one wall to another. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling, muscles tight. The sound stopped for a while, then tapped lightly at one of the windows. Not hard, just a soft click, like fingernails on glass. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to sit up. I just lay there listening. The sound came and went for what felt like hours, until finally silence returned. But even then, I couldn't relax. I knew someone had been out there, inches away, watching. The next day, I considered leaving. My car was still there, the road still passable. I could pack up and go home. But part of me resisted. I told myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe if I left now, I would feel stupid later. Besides, I had told everyone I would be here a week. I had only been here 4 nights. I decided to stay one more night and see if it happened again. That evening, I made sure to check all the doors and windows twice. I stacked a few chairs against the inside of the door, so if it opened, they would fall and make noise. I kept the lantern low and sat in the dark for a long time, just listening. Near midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. Then a faint thud against the back wall, as if someone pressed their shoulder into it. I gripped the flashlight I had beside the bed, pointing it at the door, though I knew it wouldn't do much. The sound went on for a long time, then faded. The next morning, I checked outside again. There were more boot prints, clear in the damp dirt. This time, I followed them a little way into the woods. They went in a wide circle around the cabin, then disappeared into thicker brush. I didn't go far. My nerves were already shot, and the idea of running into whoever it was out there alone scared me more than anything. By then, I knew staying was a mistake. I started packing my things, shoving them into my bag without care. My plan was to drive back to the nearest town, even if it meant hours of dirt road in the dark. But when I went to the car, my stomach dropped. Both back tires were slashed, not flat from a slow leak, sliced open. Long cuts across the rubber, deep enough to ruin them completely. I stood there staring at them, my mind blank. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone wanted me stuck here. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to think. The nearest town was about 15 miles back. If I walked fast, I could make it in a day. But the thought of walking the long dirt road with whoever had been circling the cabin somewhere in the woods made my skin crawl. Still, I couldn't stay forever. My food was limited, and I wasn't safe here. I decided I would wait through the day, try to rest, and leave at dawn. That night was the worst yet. As soon as it grew dark, the noises started. Footsteps on the porch, scratching on the walls, tapping at the windows. But this time there was more. Something hit the door hard enough to rattle the chairs stacked against it. Then silence, followed by slow breathing, as if someone stood just on the other side, waiting. I sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight, every muscle shaking. Hours passed like that, noise and silence trading places. When dawn finally came, I hadn't slept a minute. I shoved my bag over my shoulder, grabbed what little food I could carry, and stepped outside. The woods were damp with morning fog, every tree looking the same. I stayed on the dirt track, walking fast, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The feeling of being watched never left. By midday, my legs ached, and my throat was dry. I stopped only for a few minutes to eat something, then kept moving. Around me, the woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling, just silence. Late in the afternoon, I heard something behind me, a branch snapping, deliberate, close. I turned, heart racing, but saw nothing. The fog had lifted, but the trees were thick, and shadows lay everywhere. I started walking faster, almost running, but the sound followed, slow steps, matching my pace. I pushed myself until my lungs burned. When I finally stumbled out onto a wider gravel road, I nearly cried with relief. I knew if I kept following it, I would reach town. I never thought a weekend in a cabin would end up being one of the most frightening experiences of my life. When I first decided to spend a few days away from the noise of the city, I had imagined peace, quiet, and maybe some long walks in the woods. The cabin I rented was small, nothing fancy, but it was cheap, and I figured it would be good enough for me to clear my head. It was supposed to be simple, time to myself, away from the constant pressure of work and people. I wasn't looking for excitement. I wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble found me anyway. The cabin sat in the middle of thick woods, about 20 minutes from the main road. The gravel driveway leading up to it was narrow, barely enough for one car to squeeze through without scraping against tree branches. I had to drive slowly, weaving past roots and rocks sticking up through the dirt. When I finally parked in front of the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of a bird. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy. Its wooden boards had gone gray from years of weather, and the porch sagged slightly on one side. A pile of chopped firewood was stacked against the wall, and the single chimney leaned a little, but it didn't look like it was about to fall apart. Inside, it smelled of old pine and dust. The main room had a small table, 2 chairs, and a couch that looked like it hadn't been sat on in years. Against the wall was a cast iron wood stove with a pile of kindling next to it. The floor creaked with every step. There was a bedroom in the back with 1 bed, its mattress wrapped in plastic, and a bathroom that had only the basics: a toilet, a sink, and a shower stall with a curtain that clung to itself. There was no television, no internet, and no phone signal. I knew that before I came, and I had welcomed the idea. I wanted to disconnect. The first night passed quietly enough. I unpacked my bag, lit a small fire in the stove, and read by the light of a battery-powered lantern I had brought. Outside, the forest pressed close around the cabin, and when I looked through the window, I saw only blackness. The trees stood like walls, their branches blotting out the stars. I felt uneasy at first, but I told myself it was only because I wasn't used to such isolation. I had lived in the city all my life, where there was always the sound of traffic, sirens, or people shouting in the distance. Here, every sound stood out: a creak, a snap, a gust of wind. The second day was when things began to feel different. I woke up early, around 6, because the cabin grew cold at night and the silence made it hard to sleep deeply. I decided to go for a walk in the woods. The trail behind the cabin led uphill, winding between tall pines and thick undergrowth. The air was damp and cool, and every step on the soil felt soft. As I walked, I noticed little details I hadn't seen the day before. The claw marks on a tree trunk, the scatter of bones that might have been from a deer, the way the undergrowth seemed pressed down in places as if something heavy had moved through. After about an hour, I turned back. That was when I noticed the first strange thing. When I reached the cabin, I saw footprints near the porch. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and deeper in the dirt, as if someone heavier had been walking there. At first I thought it might have been a hunter or a hiker who had wandered close, but the prints led directly to the porch steps and then stopped. I checked around, expecting to see more on the other side, but there was nothing. The prints ended right there at the steps. It unsettled me, but I tried to shrug it off. Maybe the soil on the other side of the porch had been too hard to hold an impression. I went inside, made some coffee on a little camp stove, and tried not to think too much about it. That night, the unease returned stronger. I had just settled into bed when I heard it, the sound of crunching leaves outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. The steps circled the cabin, pausing now and then moving again. My heart pounded as I lay there in the dark, holding my breath. The wood stove had burned low, and the only light in the room came from the faint glow of embers. The footsteps stopped near the front door. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to shift in the bed. The floorboards groaned lightly as if something pressed against them from outside, testing them. I thought I saw a shadow move past the thin curtain over the window. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. I must have lain there for over an hour before sleep finally came, restless and shallow. The next morning, I checked the porch again. Sure enough, the dirt held fresh impressions. Footprints, the same wide, heavy ones I had seen before. They circled the cabin, just as I had heard, and ended again at the steps. Whoever it was, they hadn't come inside, but the fact that they had been out there in the middle of the night while I slept inside made my stomach knot. I told myself to leave, to pack my bag and drive away, but pride or maybe stubbornness kept me there. I had paid for 3 nights, and I told myself I wasn't going to be chased away by some hunter wandering too close. I convinced myself it was nothing, even though deep down, I knew it was something. That night was worse. The noises started earlier, just after the sun went down. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a branch, the scrape of something against the porch railing. I sat in the main room with the lantern turned low, staring at the door. My hands sweated against the handle of the hatchet I had found with the firewood. The noises moved around the cabin slowly, carefully, as if whoever was out there knew I was listening. At one point, I heard the soft, metallic sound of the door handle rattling. My throat tightened, and I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand cramped. The handle stopped moving after a few seconds, but the message was clear. They were testing it, testing me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the couch with the hatchet on my lap until the first light of morning crept through the trees. When I stepped outside, the air was colder than before. My breath came out in white clouds. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the ground. The footprints were everywhere, pressed deep into the soil. They circled the cabin again and again, sometimes close, sometimes farther out, but always around. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I went back inside, stuffed my things into my bag, and hauled it to the car. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned, but the sound seemed too loud, echoing through the trees. I half expected to see someone step out of the woods as I pulled down the gravel path, but no one appeared. The road back to the highway felt longer than it had when I arrived. Every shadow between the trees looked like it was hiding something. Every sound of snapping branches made me press harder on the gas. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and sat there for a long while, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my breathing. My chest ached from how hard my heart had pounded for the past 2 days. I don't know who or what had been out there around the cabin. Maybe it was someone living in the woods. Maybe it was someone who had seen me arrive and decided to scare me. Or maybe it was worse than that, and if I had stayed one more night, they would have tried harder than rattling the handle. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I hear footsteps outside my window. I had been looking forward to spending a few quiet days in the mountains. The cabin I rented sat at the edge of a thick forest, far away from the nearest town. I wanted silence, fresh air, and time to think. I had been stressed from work for months, and I felt like my head was always full of noise. The cabin seemed perfect for me. No phone service, no neighbors, no one to bother me. Just a simple wooden cabin with a small porch, a fireplace inside, and a view of the trees stretching out in every direction. The drive there had been long. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up the dirt road that led to the cabin. My car struggled a little on the uneven surface, but it made it. The cabin came into view after a final bend. It looked old but sturdy, with a roof that sloped down steeply and walls made of dark wood that had aged with time. The windows were small, and the door looked solid, made from heavy wood with iron hinges. A small stack of chopped logs sat under the porch roof, ready for the fireplace. I carried my bags inside. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and ash. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The main room had a simple table, 2 wooden chairs, and the fireplace against one wall. A small hallway led to a bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, and another small window. The kitchen was barely more than a counter with a sink and a propane stove. It felt isolated, but that was exactly what I wanted. I unpacked some food, set my things on the bed, and walked around to get a feel for the place. The cabin was quiet in a way that felt almost heavy, like the air pressed down on me. Outside, the forest was dense. The trees grew close together, their trunks tall and straight. The ground was covered with dead leaves, and the air was cool. I felt a sense of peace, but also something else, something I couldn't quite put into words. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The flames flickered against the wooden walls, and the warmth filled the room. I ate a simple meal of canned soup and bread, then sat by the fire for hours, staring into it. The silence outside was total. No cars, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. By the time I went to bed, the fire had burned down to embers. I lay in the dark, listening to the cabin creak and settle. At some point in the night, I woke up. I didn't know what had stirred me, but I felt alert. The cabin was silent, but I thought I had heard something outside. It had sounded faint, like a branch snapping under weight. I lay still, listening. My heart started beating harder, though I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. There were deer in the area, maybe bears. Still, the sound had felt different, heavier somehow. I forced myself to relax and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The air was cold, and the ground was damp from dew. I scanned the trees and the dirt road, trying to see if anything looked out of place. That's when I noticed something in the mud near the porch. A footprint. It wasn't mine. It was too large, and the tread didn't match my boots. It looked fresh, pressed deep into the soft ground. My stomach tightened as I stared at it. The print faced toward the cabin, not away from it. Whoever it belonged to had walked up to the cabin, maybe even right to the porch. I told myself it could have been an old print, maybe left by someone else who had stayed here before, but it looked too fresh. The edges were sharp, and the rain hadn't blurred it. I spent most of that day trying to distract myself. I hiked a little through the woods, took pictures, and sat on the porch reading. But the footprint kept coming back into my mind. When evening came, I chopped some wood for the fire. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the forest grew darker quickly. I went inside, locked the door, and lit the fire again. That night, I struggled to sleep. Every sound outside made me tense. I heard something like movement again, faint but steady, as if someone was walking slowly around the cabin. The windows were small and didn't have curtains thick enough to block the outside. I imagined someone standing just beyond them, watching. At one point, I thought I heard a faint scrape against the wall. My body froze in bed. I held my breath, listening. The sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake it. When morning came, I checked outside again. More footprints. This time, several. They circled the cabin, close to the walls, as if someone had been walking around it repeatedly during the night. My throat went dry as I traced the prints with my eyes. They stopped near one of the windows, where the ground was muddy. Whoever it was had stood there for a while. I didn't know what to do. There was no phone signal, no way to call for help. The dirt road back to town was long, and I doubted I'd get service until I was halfway down the mountain. My car was parked near the cabin, but if someone was out there, they could easily follow me or block the road. I decided to stay put during the day, keeping the doors locked. I sat by the fire, trying to think. The hours crawled by. The silence outside became unbearable. Every time a branch cracked, my heart jumped. By evening, I was exhausted but too nervous to sleep. I kept the fire low and sat in the chair facing the door, a heavy piece of firewood beside me in case I needed it. The night stretched on. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to a sound that made my skin crawl. The door handle moved. It turned slowly, creaking, as if someone outside was testing it. My body locked up with fear. The door was locked, but I could see the metal latch shifting under the pressure. Whoever it was kept trying, slow and careful, as if they hoped I wouldn't notice. I sat frozen, clutching the piece of wood in my hand. The handle stopped moving after a while, but I didn't hear footsteps walking away. It was worse than anything. The silence pressed in, and I knew someone was still there, just on the other side of the door. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the wood, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. When the light finally came, I checked outside through the window. The ground showed fresh footprints again, right at the door. That day was the longest of my life. Couldn't eat. I couldn't think straight. I knew someone wanted to get inside, and I was trapped with nowhere to go. By the third night, I was almost delirious from exhaustion. The cabin felt like a trap, every wall too thin, every window too small to protect me. The fire had burned low, and I didn't dare make too much noise chopping wood outside. In the middle of the night, I heard it again. The door. But this time there was a new sound. The metallic scrape of something thin sliding into the lock. They were trying to pick it. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the firewood and stood in the shadows, my eyes fixed on the door. The sound continued for long seconds, then stopped. Silence followed. My chest felt like it would burst. Then the door creaked. It opened. A figure stepped inside slowly, careful not to make noise. I could only see a dark outline against the faint light from outside. They paused, listening, then moved further in. I didn't think. I swung the piece of wood with all the strength I had, connected with a heavy crack. The figure staggered, crashing into the table. I swung again, hitting them in the shoulder, then again across the head. They collapsed onto the floor. I stood over them, shaking, gasping for air. The intruder didn't move. In the faint firelight, I saw a man's face, blood pooling beneath his head. His eyes were closed, and his chest didn't rise. I dropped the wood and stumbled back, my stomach turning. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I didn't sleep that night. I sat against the wall, staring at the body until daylight. When the sun rose, I dragged the man outside. My arms burned with effort, but I couldn't leave him inside with me. I checked the dirt road, then loaded my car with my bags. I left the body by the porch, my hands shaking as I climbed into the driver's seat. The drive down the mountain felt endless. Every turn of the road, I looked in the mirror, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. When I finally reached a town, I went straight to the police. I told them everything. They followed me back to the cabin. The body was still there. The man was a drifter with a history of breaking into remote homes. He had been spotted in the area before. If I hadn't fought back, they said, I probably wouldn't have made it. Even now, I can still hear the sound of the door handle turning in the middle of the night. The silence that followed was worse than anything. That cabin had promised peace and quiet, but what I found there was something I will never forget. I had been looking forward to some time alone in the woods for a long while. Life in the city had started to weigh on me. The endless traffic, the constant noise, the steady pressure of people everywhere had left me restless and drained. I wanted silence, I wanted stillness, and I wanted to be cut off from everything familiar. I rented a small cabin deep in the forest for a week. The photos online had shown a plain wooden structure, one floor with a steep roof, sitting on a clearing that was surrounded by thick pine and fir trees. There was no phone service and no internet. To me, that had sounded perfect. The cabin was about an hour's drive from the last paved road. I had to follow a long dirt track that was full of ruts and scattered with rocks. The suspension of my car groaned every time I hit a dip too hard. There were no signs, no lights, and no houses nearby once I left the main road. The track wound through the trees, climbing slowly uphill, until at last the clearing opened up and the cabin stood there. The sight of it gave me a kind of comfort at first. It looked solid, simple, and private. The wooden walls were stained a dark brown, the roof was shingled in gray, and a small porch stretched across the front. Behind it, the forest pressed in, dense and unbroken. I parked beside it and carried my supplies inside. The air smelled sharp and fresh, full of pine sap and damp soil. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind passing through branches above. Inside, the cabin was plain. There was one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen space against the far wall, and a door that led to a single bedroom. The furniture was sparse and old, but everything worked. There was a propane stove, a small fridge running on gas, and a bed with a thin mattress. The bathroom was tiny with only a cold water sink and a compost toilet. For showering, there was a tank outside that could be filled and warmed by the sun, though in September the water was already icy. I didn't mind. I had come prepared for rough living. The first evening was quiet. I set my food supplies on the counter, stacked the firewood that had been left under the porch, and walked the edges of the clearing to look around. Beyond the open space, the forest began almost immediately, a wall of trunks so close together that little light passed between them. I noticed a faint trail leading away from the cabin to the west. It was narrow, almost overgrown, but it was there. I told myself I might follow it later in the week to see where it led. As night fell, the silence grew even heavier. Without city lights, the darkness came quickly and it was absolute. I lit a lantern and kept a fire burning in the fireplace. The crackle of the flames became the only sound, and I found myself listening to it closely because every pause or change in its rhythm made the silence feel deeper. The first night was uneasy, but I told myself that was normal. It takes time to adjust when you've been surrounded by noise for years. I went to bed early and slept in fits, waking often to the groaning of the cabin walls or to the whistle of wind outside. The next morning, I woke stiff but calmer. I made coffee, ate some oatmeal, and decided to explore a little. I followed the narrow trail that I had noticed the day before. The ground was covered in damp needles and moss, and the trees rose tall all around me. I walked slowly, noting how quiet it was. My footsteps were soft, but they sounded too loud in the stillness. The trail wound downhill for a while and then seemed to split. One branch faded into the undergrowth, the other curved sharply. I chose the clearer path and followed it for another 10 minutes. Eventually, it led to a small stream cutting through the trees. The water was shallow and cold, running fast over rocks. I crouched down and dipped my hand in, feeling the chill. Something about the place made me turn back sooner than I had planned. It wasn't fear, at least not in a direct way, but more a sense of not belonging there. The forest seemed closed around me, watchful in its silence. When I got back to the clearing and saw the cabin waiting, I felt relief. The days settled into a pattern. I read books I had brought, I cooked simple meals, I split wood, and I sat outside on the porch just listening to the forest. Every so often I heard the call of a bird or the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush, but mostly it was still. Each evening the shadows seemed to fall faster than the night before, and each night I grew more aware of the dark pressing close against the windows. On the fourth night, I woke around 2 in the morning. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I realized I had heard something, a sound that was different from the wind and different from the settling wood of the cabin. It was a crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart picked up. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every nerve straining to catch the next sound. It came again, faint but clear, somewhere outside the bedroom window. Slow steps, one at a time, moving across the clearing. I forced myself to stay still. I didn't want to make a sound that would tell whoever it was that I was awake. The footsteps came closer, circled the side of the cabin, then stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Minutes passed. Then the sound returned, this time moving away into the trees. I barely slept after that. When the gray light of dawn came, I went outside and checked the ground around the cabin. The soil was soft in places, covered in pine needles, but I found faint impressions near the corner of the porch. They weren't animal prints. They were shoes. The shape was clear enough even though the detail was faint. Someone had been walking there. The knowledge settled in me like a weight. The forest wasn't empty after all. Someone else was out there. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it had been a hunter or a hiker who had gotten lost. Maybe someone had stumbled on the cabin by chance and was just curious. But the way the steps had circled, the way they had stopped outside the bedroom window didn't feel like an accident. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I stacked more firewood and kept busy, but my ears were tuned constantly to the forest. Several times I thought I heard faint cracks of branches, as if someone was moving in the distance. Each time I froze and listened, but nothing followed. That night, I made sure the lantern was turned low so it wouldn't shine too brightly through the windows. I locked the door even though the lock was simple and flimsy. I sat by the fire for hours listening. When I finally went to bed, I kept the flashlight beside me. The sounds came again almost at the same time as the night before. The slow crunch of footsteps. This time they didn't circle. They stopped directly outside the porch. I could hear the faint creak of wood as if someone had placed weight on the steps. My chest tightened and my skin prickled cold. The person stood there for a long time. I could picture them in my mind, standing in the dark just feet from the door, looking at the cabin. Eventually, the sound retreated again, back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat upright in bed until the morning light finally came. When the sun was up, I checked again. The ground on the edge of the porch showed a clearer print this time, pressed deep into the damp soil. Definitely a shoe, a large size. The fear changed something in me. I no longer felt like I had come out here for peace. I felt hunted. My sense of safety was gone. I considered packing up and leaving, but the road out was long and rough, and I told myself it might be safer to wait until morning to make the drive. Still, I couldn't shake the dread that came each time I looked at the line of trees. On the 6th night, the footsteps came earlier. I was still awake, sitting by the fire, when I heard them. This time they were heavier, less careful. They came straight across the clearing and up to the porch. The creak of wood was louder, closer. Then silence. I sat frozen, heart pounding. After several minutes, I forced myself to stand and turn down the lantern until the room was almost dark. I waited. I thought about the fact that the door was just thin wood with one small lock. If someone wanted to come in, they could. I didn't sleep. I stayed up all night listening to every shift of the wind, every creak of the walls. At one point, I thought I heard the faint scrape of something against the door, but it didn't last. When morning came, I made my decision. I would leave. I packed my bags, loaded the car, and took one last look at the cabin. It had seemed harmless when I first arrived, but now it felt like a trap sitting in the middle of an endless forest. I drove down the dirt road fast, the tires bumping hard against the ruts. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the paved road and then the nearest town, my body felt drained, but the weight in my chest lifted. I had escaped without anything happening to me, but I knew what I had heard and seen. Someone had been out there, circling the cabin at night, watching through the windows. The thought of what might have happened if I had stayed another night still turns my stomach. I never went back to that cabin again. The silence I had wanted so badly had turned into the worst kind of silence. The kind where you know you are not alone, but you cannot see who else is there. The memory of those footsteps in the dark porch stayed with me, clear and sharp, and I learned that peace and isolation are not always the same thing. I did not go to the cabin expecting peace, but I told myself it would be quiet enough to let my mind settle. The place was small, an old wooden structure tucked away at the far end of a dirt road that hardly anyone used anymore. I had found it through someone I knew who said it was left and used most of the year, and since I wanted some time alone, it seemed perfect. The road to get there was rough, with potholes and rocks sticking up through the thin dirt path. My car rattled and shook until I finally pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The air felt colder than I expected for that time of year. The sky was gray with heavy clouds drifting slowly, and I remember thinking how the light made the cabin look more worn down than I imagined. The roof sagged a little, the wood on the walls was dark and stained from years of rain and snow, and the single porch step groaned under my weight when I walked up. Inside, it smelled of dust and damp wood, as though it had been closed up for months. There was one main room with a small fireplace, an old couch, a table, and a separate narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The windows were small, smudged, and let in little light. I set my bag down near the couch and stood for a while, listening. There was nothing. No cars in the distance, no voices, no sounds of the world outside except for wind moving through the trees. Felt strangely heavy, that silence. I lit a lantern I found on the table, and its dim light spread a soft glow through the room. My plan was to stay there for several nights. I had food, water, and supplies in the car. After unloading everything, I went outside again and looked at the tree line. The forest pressed close to the clearing, tall pines rising in every direction, their tops swaying in the wind. It felt like the woods were closing me in, as if the clearing was the only space where I could breathe. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the fireplace, ate from a can, and sat on the couch. The sounds of the fire crackling were the only comfort I had. When I finally turned everything down and lay in bed, I noticed how thin the walls felt. The cold came through, and I could hear every creak of the wood as the cabin shifted. I struggled to sleep, tossing under the weight of the silence. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something faint, like movement outside. But when I listened harder, there was nothing but the wind. By the second night, I had walked around the property a little during the day. I went a few dozen yards into the woods, but the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. There was no path, only thick trees and brush. The ground was soft, littered with fallen needles and branches. I had the sense that someone could be standing a short distance away and I wouldn't notice them until I was nearly on top of them. That thought stayed with me and I returned to the clearing. The more I thought about it, the less I wanted to wander. That night, I was sitting by the fire again when I heard it. A sound outside. It was faint, but sharp enough to cut through the wind. Something had stepped on a branch. The snap of wood. I froze where I sat. My eyes went to the window, but the glass was dirty and the lantern light only reflected my own shadow. I turned the lantern down and sat in the dim glow of the fire, trying to listen. Minutes passed, and there was nothing else. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Later that same night, when I had gone to bed, I woke up suddenly. My eyes opened to darkness, but my ears caught something outside. It was softer this time, more like steady movement. The ground crunching, slow and careful. I held my breath and lay still. The sound circled part of the cabin, then stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, but I stayed awake until the first gray light of dawn showed through the small window in the bedroom. On the third day, I tried to push the unease out of my head. I spent time stacking firewood and cleaning a little inside, but the thought of the noise never left me. I checked around the cabin, scanning the dirt and leaves for prints, but the ground was too messy to read. I didn't see anything unusual. Still, I could not shake the feeling. The air seemed heavier that day. Even the birds were quiet in the trees. That night, it came again. I had left the fire low, but not out, and I was lying on the couch instead of in the bedroom. The sound returned, movement outside. I was sure of it now. Slow steps, not rushed, not wandering, but placed carefully, like someone walking with intent. My body tightened with fear. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but there was something about the rhythm of the steps that felt wrong. They were too deliberate, too evenly spaced. I sat in silence, staring at the dark window, waiting for something to show. Nothing did. Minutes passed before the steps moved again, shifting to the side of the cabin. I tracked them with my ears, feeling the hair rise on my arms. They circled once, and then there was silence. I did not sleep after that. I kept the lantern low and stayed awake until morning. On the fourth day, my nerves were raw. Every small sound in the woods made me turn. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I could handle one more night. That was a mistake. When the sun went down, the fear came back stronger than before. I sat on the couch again, watching the fire, listening. Hours passed. Then, at some point past midnight, there was a noise at the door. Not scratching, not bumping. Something brushed against it. Then a faint rattle, as if the handle had been touched. My heart slammed in my chest. I did not move, I only stared at the door. It stopped after a few seconds. Silence followed, but the silence felt worse than the sound. I knew then that it wasn't an animal. No animal rattles a door handle. Someone was outside. I stayed awake, gripping the heavy flashlight I kept near me. At dawn, I packed my things. My plan to stay longer was gone. I loaded everything back into the car as quickly as I could. Before I left, I walked once around the cabin. That was when I saw it. In the dirt near the back wall, under one of the windows, was a clear footprint. It wasn't old. It was fresh, pressed deep into the soft ground. A man's boot. I didn't stop to look for more. I got in my car and drove away, the tires throwing dirt behind me as I forced the car over the rough road. I did not slow until I reached the highway, and even then my hands gripped the wheel so hard they ached. The cabin grew smaller in the distance behind me, hidden again by trees. I never went back, and I never asked who else might know about the place. The footprint was enough. had been looking forward to some time alone for weeks. My life in the city had been loud, busy, and draining. Work had piled up, I was hardly sleeping, and I felt like I needed to get away from everything for a while. A friend of mine told me about a small cabin he had used once, way up in the woods, far from any towns. He said it was old but still in good shape, and that it was the perfect place if I wanted peace and quiet. I didn't think much before deciding to go. It sounded exactly like what I needed. I packed enough food for a week, a few gallons of water, a sleeping bag, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a small toolkit just in case. I had a backpack full of clothes, a first aid kit, and a few other small things like matches, a lighter, and a hunting knife I kept more for comfort than use. I didn't plan to do any hunting or anything like that. I just wanted to sit in the cabin, read, maybe hike a little, and let myself breathe for once. The drive there was long. The road turned from smooth asphalt into cracked dirt paths. Trees grew closer together the farther I went. Cell service had cut out an hour earlier, and I didn't expect it to come back. The last stretch of the drive was nothing more than 2 tracks through tall grass. I had to take it slow, and I worried more than once that my car might get stuck. Finally, I reached a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It wasn't much to look at, just a single-story wooden structure, weathered and gray, with a small porch that had 2 broken steps. The roof was metal, a bit rusty but still intact. A chimney leaned slightly to one side. There was only one window in the front and another on the side, both small and covered in grime. The door looked solid enough, though the wood had cracks here and there. I parked a little distance away, unloaded my bags, and walked inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress against the wall. There was no electricity, no running water, no signs of modern comfort. Just 4 walls and a roof. First, I liked it. It was quiet in a way that felt almost unreal. I could hear the wind in the trees outside, the occasional creak of the cabin settling, and nothing else. No cars, no people, no phones buzzing. Just silence. I set my things down, unrolled my sleeping bag on the bed, and started to settle in. The first day passed without much happening. I walked a bit around the area, stayed within sight of the cabin so I wouldn't lose track of it. The woods were thick, the trees tall, and the ground covered in leaves. It felt untouched. I cooked some canned food on the stove, read a little by flashlight, and went to bed early. I thought I was finally going to get the rest I wanted. But that night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. Every time I opened my eyes, the cabin felt darker than before, the silence heavier. At one point, I was sure I heard something outside, like footsteps in the leaves. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The air was cold and damp. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, I felt unsettled. There were no clear tracks around the cabin, but the leaves on the ground made it hard to tell if anything had walked nearby. I shook it off, telling myself I was just not used to the wilderness. The second day went much like the first. I hiked a little farther, collected some wood for the stove, and spent time just sitting on the porch listening to the woods. It should have been peaceful, but there was always this edge to it, like I was waiting for something. Every small crack of a branch made me look up. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded too much like movement. I tried to ignore it. That night, things felt different. I was lying in bed, my flashlight off, the stove slowly burning out, when I heard something again. This time, it wasn't just a step. It was more drawn out, like someone dragging something through the leaves outside. I held my breath, listening, stopped for a while, then started again, closer this time. My skin crawled. I gripped the knife beside my bed, even though I knew it wouldn't make much difference if someone really was out there. I didn't move for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. In the morning, I went outside and looked around again. Still nothing. No tracks I could see, no signs of anyone. The air felt heavy, though, like the woods were holding something back. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. I had wanted peace and quiet, and that was exactly what I had. Maybe I just wasn't used to it. On the third night, I woke to a noise that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of wood being pressed, the porch boards creaking, the sound of weight. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The steps were slow, deliberate. I could picture someone standing just outside the door. Then it stopped. I lay there for hours, waiting for another sound, but none came. When daylight finally came, I checked the porch. The boards looked the same, though I noticed one of the steps seemed slightly more worn, like fresh pressure had been on it. My stomach tightened. I told myself again it could be animals, but deep down I didn't believe it. The days blurred after that. I kept myself busy with small things: chopping wood, boiling water, walking short distances from the cabin. But I was sleeping less and less, always waking to noises. Sometimes it was the sound of something brushing against the wall outside. Sometimes it was the crunch of leaves in the distance. Once I thought I saw movement between the trees, but when I stared hard, it was gone. By the fifth night, I had barely slept at all. I sat awake in the dark, holding the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. The noises came again. This time it wasn't just the porch. I heard scratching against the wall, light at first, then harder. I wanted to jump up and shout, but fear kept me frozen. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. The scratching went on for minutes, then stopped suddenly. The next day, I finally decided I needed to leave. I packed my bag quickly, grabbed everything I could, and walked to my car. I was shaking the whole time. When I reached the car, I found something that made me stop cold. On the dusty back window, someone had dragged a hand across it. For long streaks through the dirt like fingers. I hadn't touched it since arriving. I drove away without looking back. The road was rough, the trees closing in around me, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. Every mile felt longer than the last. When I finally reached the main road and saw another car in the distance, I felt like I could breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my friend about it, and I never told anyone what happened. But even now, when I think about it, I remember the feeling of those nights. The sound of weight on the porch, the scratching on the walls, the marks on the car. I tell myself it was just someone passing through, maybe a stranger in the woods curious about the cabin. But the way they never showed themselves, the way they only moved at night, the way they watched without ever coming inside. It sits in the back of my mind like a weight I can't get rid of. I went there for peace and quiet, and I found something else entirely. Something I'll never fully understand, but something I'll never forget. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was simple: get away from the noise of town, from the constant pull of work, and spend a few quiet days in the woods. I wanted to be alone, far away from phones, traffic, and people. I found a small cabin listed online. It looked old but sturdy, with wood walls darkened by age, a stone chimney, and a small deck that faced the trees. It was deep in the forest, only reachable by a dirt road that stretched far away from the highway. The pictures made it seem peaceful, and the thought of having that quiet place all to myself felt like exactly what I needed. I packed light, only a backpack with food, some water, a flashlight, batteries, a blanket, and a small hatchet I kept for camping trips. I wasn't planning on hiking much, just staying at the cabin, reading, writing, and resting. I told myself it was going to be easy, just a long weekend of stillness. The drive was long. Once I left the highway, the road narrowed, curving through thick trees. The dirt road was bumpy, and my car rattled over rocks and loose gravel. I noticed how dense the forest was on both sides. The trees grew tall and close together, their branches leaning over the road, blocking out the sky. The deeper I drove, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of other cars, distant houses, or planes faded until all I heard was the crunch of tires on gravel. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already sinking. The cabin looked smaller in person than it had in the photos. The wood was more worn, the windows a little dirtier, the steps leading up to the deck slightly tilted. Still, it seemed solid enough. There was no one around, no other houses in sight, no sign of people at all. Just trees on every side and the forest floor covered in leaves, moss, and fallen branches. I carried my backpack inside. The air smelled stale, as if no one had been there for months. Dust floated in the dim light coming through the window. The furniture was simple. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, a couch with torn fabric, and a narrow bed against the far wall. There was an old stove in the corner and shelves with a few pots and pans left behind. The windows didn't have curtains, only thin blinds that barely covered the glass. I set my things down and walked through each room. The cabin wasn't big, just one main room and a smaller side room that looked like it had once been a pantry. The door to the pantry wouldn't close all the way, the frame crooked from years of shifting wood. There was also a back door leading into the thick trees. It had a rusty lock, and when I tested it, it took some effort to push the bolt across. I lit a candle I found on the shelf, since the cabin had no electricity. I had brought a flashlight, but I wanted to save the batteries. As the light filled the room, I felt a strange weight settle in my chest. The silence outside was heavy, thicker than I expected. In town, even in quiet neighborhoods, there are always distant noises. Dogs barking, cars passing, people talking. Here there was nothing. Only the occasional creak of wood from the cabin settling and the faint sound of wind moving through the branches outside. That night, I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The mattress was thin and lumpy, the blanket itchy. I listened to the silence, waiting for it to calm me. Instead, it made me tense. Every small sound, the snap of a twig outside, the groan of the wood under my body, made my ears strain. My mind kept wandering. I wondered how far the nearest person was, how long it would take someone to get here if I needed help. The thought of being so far removed from everyone else felt different when the sun went down. I eventually drifted off, though my sleep was light. The next morning, I tried to shake the unease by exploring the area. I walked a short way into the woods, careful to keep the cabin in sight. The ground was uneven, roots twisting out of the soil, rocks half buried beneath leaves. Birds fluttered overhead, but even their calls seemed muted compared to what I was used to. I found a small stream not far away, the water cold and clear. For a moment, it felt good. I filled my bottle, washed my face, and told myself I was overthinking. The day passed slowly. I sat on the deck, reading and writing. The sun moved across the sky, light shifting through the branches. By evening, the shadows stretched long again, and I felt that same unease settle in. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, the smell of food filling the small room. I tried to focus on the warmth of it, the comfort. When night fell, I locked both doors and made sure the windows were closed. The lock on the back door still stuck, and I had to slam my shoulder against it to slide the bolt in place. I crawled into bed, the candle flickering on the table. That was when I heard it, a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a slow crunch of leaves, as if someone had stepped on them. My body went rigid. I held my breath, straining my ears. Another crunch, closer this time. It wasn't steady like an animal moving quickly. It was slow, careful. I reached for the flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it at the window. The beam hit the blinds, and I could see dust dancing in the light, but nothing outside. I turned it off, my heart pounding. For a long time, I lay frozen, listening. The sounds came and went. Sometimes they were faint, almost distant, other times closer, circling. Each time, I told myself it could be an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps felt too deliberate, too slow. Animals don't move like that. They run, they scatter, they shift through the brush quickly. These steps were measured. Eventually, the noises faded, and I must have dozed off, though my sleep was broken by sudden jerks awake, my heart racing. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I went to the stream again, forcing myself to act normal. But when I returned to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the soft ground near the side of the cabin, there were prints. Not clear shoe prints, but enough of a shape to know they weren't from an animal. The heel and edge of a sole pressed faintly into the dirt. They were close to the window. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The prints weren't fresh, but they weren't washed away either. Whoever made them had been here recently. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting someone to step out. I didn't wander far. I stayed close to the cabin, my nerves stretched tight. That night, the noises came again. This time, they started earlier while it was still dusk. I was sitting at the table, writing, when I heard the first crunch. My head shot up, my ears straining. Another step, slow, dragging, moving across the leaves. The hair on my arms stood up. My chest tightened. I reached for the hatchet and held it in my hand. The room felt smaller, the walls thinner. I backed up toward the bed, the flashlight ready in the other hand. The steps circled. Sometimes they faded, sometimes they drew closer. At one point, I swore I heard the faint scrape of a hand against the wall outside. I barely slept. Every noise jolted me awake. The candle burned low, the shadows shifting across the room. I kept staring at the door, at the thin blinds covering the windows. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I was going to leave. Whatever peace I had hoped to find here was gone. I packed my things quickly, shoving them into my backpack. When I stepped outside, the air was damp, the ground wet with dew. I scanned the trees, but everything looked still. I walked to my car, parked a short distance from the cabin. That was when I noticed the tracks again. Fresh this time, clear. Footprints in the mud near the car. Someone had been here. My hands shook as I unlocked the car, tossed my bag inside, and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the sound shattering the silence. My eyes darted to the trees, half expecting movement, but nothing came. As I pulled away, my tires sprayed gravel. The cabin grew smaller in the mirror until it vanished completely. The trees pressed close on both sides as I drove down the dirt road, my hands tight on the wheel, my chest heaving with each breath. It wasn't until I reached the highway that I felt some of the weight lift. The sound of other cars, the sight of open space, felt like relief. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I went up to the cabin at the start of fall. The air had turned cooler, and the woods had a different kind of silence than in summer. The leaves had begun to turn, though many of them still clung green to the trees. I had planned the trip weeks before, not to hunt or to fish, but just to get away for a while. The cabin belonged to a family friend who let me use it whenever I asked. It sat on the edge of a large patch of forestland, far from towns and roads. The only way to reach it was a dirt track that ran for miles off the main highway. Once you drove up, there was no one else around, no houses, no neighbors, no passing cars. Just trees, rocks, and silence. I had been there before, but never alone for more than a single night. This time I meant to stay for nights. I brought everything I needed in the trunk of my car. Food sealed up in containers, extra fuel, blankets, a lantern, a small axe, and a gun I had borrowed, though I hoped not to need it. The cabin itself was small, a single room with a sleeping loft above. It had a wood stove for heat, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves with old tools left by others who had used it before me. There was no running water, only a pump a short walk downhill, and no power except for the lanterns and flashlights I carried. When I arrived that first day, everything felt as it always had. Quiet, safe. The ground outside was damp from earlier rain, and the smell of wet leaves filled the air. I unlocked the door with the old key, stepped inside, and set my bags down on the table. Dust floated in the streaks of light coming through the windows. It looked untouched since the last time I had been there. I cleaned up a little, swept the floor with the stiff broom, stacked firewood beside the stove, and laid out my sleeping bag in the loft. The first evening went by without trouble. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, sat at the table, and listened to the sounds outside. Mostly it was wind moving through the trees. Once in a while a branch snapped or a bird called, but mostly it was still. When night fell, it grew very dark. There were no distant glows of towns, no headlights, nothing but black outside the windows. I lit the lantern, kept it beside me, and wrote in a small notebook I had brought. After some hours, I put it out and went up into the loft. The first night I slept heavily. I woke once when I thought I heard something outside, but it had only been a branch sliding down the roof. By morning, I was rested. I spent that day walking the paths behind the cabin, following them deep into the woods. The air was sharp but clean, and I liked how it felt on my face. By late afternoon, I was back at the cabin, tired but satisfied. I cooked again, read a little, and thought about how good it was to be away from everything. That night, things changed. It started with the sound of movement outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. I had heard deer before, their hooves striking the ground, and once the sound of a bear crashing through brush. But this sound was different. It was steady, not the random pattern of an animal. It was the sound of steps, slow, deliberate steps on the ground outside the cabin. I froze when I first heard them. I was sitting at the table with the lantern burning low. The steps circled once, then stopped. I waited, telling myself it had to be a trick of my ears. I stood, walked softly to the window, and peered out. The darkness was heavy, but the moon gave enough light to see shapes. First, I saw nothing. Then I noticed the figure standing near the tree line. A man. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he stood very still. I could not see his face, only the outline of his body against the trees. My chest tightened. There was no reason for anyone to be there. No one knew I was at the cabin except the family friend, and even he would never come without telling me. I stayed at the window for several minutes, not moving, hardly breathing. The man did not move either. Then, slowly, he stepped backward until the trees hit him. I strained to see, but he was gone. I spent the rest of that night wide awake. I sat at the table with the lantern, the gun beside me. Every little noise outside made my nerves jolt. Sometimes I thought I heard more footsteps, sometimes not. I did not sleep at all. When daylight finally came, I felt almost sick with exhaustion. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the trees. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints that I could see, though the ground was covered in leaves. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that the mind plays tricks in the dark. But the more I thought about the way the man had stood so still, the more I knew it had been real. I spent that day uneasy. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping wood, keeping busy, but always glancing at the woods. Nothing happened all morning, and by the afternoon, I tried to convince myself again that maybe I had just seen shadows. I thought of leaving, but I told myself it was only the second day, that I had food and supplies, and that it would be foolish to cut the trip short because of fear. That night, the man came back. It was later, maybe close to midnight. I had tried to sleep in the loft, but I woke with the feeling that something was wrong. At first, I only heard the wind, then the steps again, slow, steady, circling. My heart pounded in my ears. I grabbed the gun, crept to the edge of the loft, and looked down toward the window. The lantern was out, but the moonlight made a faint glow inside. I could see movement outside the window. Someone passed by slowly, close to the wall. I held my breath, gripping the gun tight. Then came the sound of the doorknob. Turned slightly, the old metal rattled. I aimed the gun toward the door, certain it would open, but it didn't. The knob turned once more, then stopped. After that, silence. I stayed frozen in place for an hour, the gun aimed, my eyes fixed on the door. No one came inside. Finally, when I felt I couldn't stand it any longer, I crept back to the loft and waited out the night. The morning after was worse than the one before. I checked the door. It was locked just as I had left it. I checked the ground outside, but again there was no clear sign of footprints, only the churned leaves. I thought of leaving right then, but part of me wanted to believe it was only someone passing through, maybe a lost hunter, though deep down I knew that wasn't true. The way he had stood in the trees, the way he had tried the knob, it wasn't by chance. I spent most of the day inside, too tense to enjoy anything. Every noise set me off. Every shadow outside the window caught my eye. I barely ate. When the sun started to go down, I felt dread building in me. And when night came, it was worse than before. The man returned again, and this time he came closer. I heard him at the window, slow breathing against the glass. I didn't move, just stayed upstairs in the loft, watching the faint shape of him as he leaned against the wall. Then came the scratching. Something sharp dragged across the wood of the cabin. It was a long, slow scrape over and over. I gripped the gun so tight my hands hurt. He stayed for hours, sometimes silent, sometimes circling, sometimes scratching at the walls. He tried the door again. He even pushed against it once, the wood groaning, but the lock held. At one point I heard him climbing, maybe testing the side of the cabin, maybe trying the loft window. I pressed my back against the wall, sure he would come in. But he didn't. When dawn came, I stepped outside and found marks carved into the wood of the cabin. Long lines, deep enough to show they had been done with a knife or some sharp tool. They were all along the walls and even near the door frame. That was when I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things as quickly as I could. My hands shook as I shoved food back into containers and stuffed my sleeping bag into the pack. I kept the gun close, listening for any sound outside. By mid-morning, I was ready. I stepped out to the car, loaded everything in, and slid behind the wheel. When I turned the key, the engine didn't start. Cranked weakly, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the fuel gauge, there was gas. I lifted the hood, though I knew nothing about engines, and stared down at it. Nothing looked wrong, but the car wouldn't start. I went cold. The thought hit me that maybe the man had tampered with it. Maybe while I slept the first night, he had done something to make sure I couldn't leave. The cabin was miles from the highway. Walking out would take hours, maybe the whole day, and I would be on foot with someone in the woods following me. So I stayed another night. That night was the worst of all. The man came back before it was even fully dark. I heard him in the trees, closer, circling faster. The scratching turned into pounding. At one point, he slammed against the door so hard the frame shook. I thought it would give way. I sat on the loft floor, gun aimed at the ladder, heart slamming so hard I thought it would burst. It went on for hours. Sometimes silence, then sudden loud knocks on the walls, then footsteps running around the cabin. Once I heard him laughing low outside, though it might have only been my mind twisting the sounds. I didn't sleep at all. When morning finally came, I knew I had no choice. I couldn't stay another night. I packed what I could carry, slung the pack over my shoulder,